Pro, Matt Kling,
Hey, what's up?
and Silver Pro, Michael Hinderrocker.
How's it going? Sorry, I was just pausing to keep it consistent.
For emphasis, you know,
Just
Michael,
letting that hang there a little bit.
Michael, it's really funny. I was, for those who don't know, we had a discussion about like how hard 4 people would be for the podcast last week with John Stern, and Michael bowed out. But I immediately regretted it because I really had wished that we got to hear Michael talk to John. So it's nice to have you back, Michael. I'm really, really excited about this one.
Well, I'm happy to be back, and I'm happy to be at least slightly missed. Although, if you could replace me with John Stern, that sounds like a strict upgrade.
Well, you know what, Michael? Today, or not today, 2 days ago, but we're recording today, is 5 years of constructive criticism. So I'm going to open up a bottle of super cheap champagne, and I'm going to drink it on the podcast this week. This is 5 years of podcasting. So I'm going to drink this bottle of champagne on this podcast. As, first of all, it's a super tough topic this week. Yeah, that happened. But I'm really excited, guys. So this week, we're going to talk about Standard. And we're going to talk about each other. So we're going to go over each other's biggest strengths and weaknesses, including ourselves. So there's some self-evaluation this week. There's talking how terrible Spencer is at Magic. And, there's just some honesty. And, part of the point of this podcast is always improving, right? And I think that what sometimes, you get caught in yourself and, like, the things that you're working on. And sometimes you can ask your friends who get to watch you play Magic and ask, like, what is the biggest thing that I can work right now from your friends? And that's kind of what we're going to do this week. So before we do that, though, don't forget to check out our sponsors at mtgoasis.com and Ink Gaming. You can check them out at mtgoasis.com and is it just ink.gaming.com? I need to look this up. It's somewhere on the screen. And you can use the code CC.
It's just inkedgaming.com.
Is it? I didn't know if there was a period or not. But you can use the code CCMTG10 at checkout. And you can also use the code CCMTG as those that be good at Oasis Games. All of those are going to help you out at these different websites. And we really appreciate both the sponsorships. And we'll get more into them during their own segments. But you can check out the rest of the podcast at Limited Time Only, Constructive Criticism, Common Knowledge, all those things, constructivecriticism.com. We really love doing this content for you. We stream 4 days a week for Trophy Mages. There's tons of stuff going on. We highly recommend it, as well as our newest podcast, Homeward Path. So check all that out. No Always Improving segment this week. We're going to go right on to our Patreon question. If you want to support the show directly, you can go to patreon.com/ccmtg. You can Patreon the show. And this week's question, Matt, is what is the best way to test?
Man, I had such a good Always Improving moment this week, too. That's unfortunate.
Did you not read the show notes?
I did read the show notes, but I just had a really good Always Improving moment, like, in my life.
Do you want to
Not
share
just,
it?
like, for the show.
Share it.
I would like to share it.
Yeah, go.
So basically, I had an epiphany at some point today when we were talking about matchups, and it was several of us talking about matchups, and everybody had very different opinions. And it occurred to me that the reason that we all have very different opinions of these matchups is because we're not actually working with the same lists. Like, for instance, earlier today, I was talking to Michael about a mono blue deck that's, like, featuring Siren Storm Tamer and a bunch of nonsense. But he was saying that it's actually an insane matchup.
That deck is actually kind of common on Moto right now. I've played against it myself.
Sure. Well, so he was saying that it was a really good matchup for Stompy, and I was looking at the deck with a bunch of Essence Scatters and Unsummons and thinking, it seems unlikely to me that it would have a good matchup. But then I thought about that Michael and I were testing, and it was Stompy with Adventurous Impulses and Verdurous Gearhulks and Walking Ballistas, so kind of like a Stompy Snake hybrid. And I think that when you change cards in a deck, you actually can swing matchups drastically, and that's not something that I had considered before. And it really made me think that people were just wrong about certain matchups. When actually what I should have been thinking is, what are they doing different with their list to make these matchups better?
One thing, Michael, did you? I know that you guys were testing this together. Was this the list from the Pro Tour that somebody had recommended? Because I saw this list, and I personally thought, like, this is the best. It plays no Galtas, right? And then it's like a Verdurous Impulse deck. I think this list was featured on Fireball, right?
No, so that one won a PTQ in Orlando. This was just ninth place from Andrew Beckstrom lost a win and end presumably with this deck this weekend in LA.
Oh, okay. Because I have seen an article on Fireball talking about Impulse. I've seen multiple lists on Twitter talking about Gearhulk and not playing Galta. Were you guys playing Galta?
Not in this
No,
list,
it was not.
no.
Okay. Yeah, I think that this is something that we'll probably get into during our training grounds, but I do also think that what Michael's saying, what Matt is saying here is absolutely true, which is like, are there things that this person is doing to swing a matchup that you think is bad, and what can you learn from that? Because if you don't think about Magic that way, it's super easy to think like, well, I already know what this matchup is like. This person is just wrong. I've played, 20, 30 games.
Yeah, it's very easy to say, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. Like, obviously, I played this X matchup a bunch of times, so I know what it's like. It goes back to like we were talking last week about blue-white control versus Esper, and you said that you felt like blue-white had a great matchup there. And in the past, I always felt like Esper was favored, but at some point we kind of started talking about lists, and I realized that the Esper decks aren't playing things like Nine of Malice anymore. They're not playing things like
Right.
There were some other sideboard options that we were playing in Esper specifically to beat blue-white at the time, and it also occurred to me that you were playing, or you mentioned that you were playing Knight of Graces and History of Analias.
Right.
Yeah.
So no, that's exactly right. And like understanding that I think that for one that multiple people can be right about a matchup depending on their lists, and also trying to learn like, is this person doing something different, or do I not understand the matchup, and like kind of weighing those things. One of the things that I saw,
Right.
I actually just like to add on top of this. For a couple weeks, I've been saying that mono red Wizards was super well positioned, but I personally have not had wins with the deck. And I'm like, I know this deck is well positioned, I just don't know how to build it. And there was a list that played either 20 or 21 lands, 2 Hazarets, it's only 4 drops, 3 what is the card called? The enchantment.
The Flame of Keld.
Flame of Kelds.
The Flame of Keld.
Yeah. And like I was like, oh, this list actually makes perfect sense for everything I was trying to do. And I think that like knowing that something is correct, but you don't know how to build it, just means that you need to look at stuff and see what other people have figured out.
Yeah, I mean, I think my ultimate takeaway from kind of this whole conversation is just that we get so caught up in like trying to save time by sort of using shorthand.
Oh yeah.
Like we're just lumping decks together, right? But really, as soon as you start changing cards, decks aren't necessarily going to play out exactly the same. And it's mostly, for better or worse, it's important to recognize that, right? When you start cutting cards or adding cards for one matchup, all of your matchups change.
I agree. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's go into our Patreon question. If you want to support the show directly, you can go to patreon.com/ccmtg. Become a patron of the show. Our Patreon question this week is: what is the best way to test with other people online? I used to use Cockatrice, but can't find any good games anymore. I know this problem all too well. Don't use it. And Geo sounds great, but I'm not sure how much standard would cost, so we could both play decks. Oh, okay. We also don't really know where to start. Do we test versus other people? Play leagues together? What about paper testing via Skype? Is that something you have thought about? Interested to hear Spencer's answer as the PPTQ grinder on the cast. Thanks for the podcast. This question comes from Brian. I'll go first because he mentioned me. I don't think... So I don't know where you are in relation to each other, but I don't believe that there's a world in which playing via paper on Skype is correct. If you're going to do that, you might as well use Cockatrice because it's going to be faster, or MTGO if you already have the decks. Now, as far as things that I found useful, I think that playing leagues together is higher than playing versus each other. However, if you want to learn about specifics matchups, playing versus each other is significantly faster than playing versus leagues because you can guarantee that you can do the things you want to do. Other than that, I think that like playing online, those are your like MTGO is your best option right now. And the reason for that is because Arena doesn't have heads-up matchups. Uh, Arena doesn't have ways for you to. I mean, you could play Arena leagues together, but due to the time constraints on your turns on Arena, I actually think it would be hard to like play together on Arena, and I actually think MTGO is better suited for that. So if like you're playing two people to a league or playing versus each other, I think MTGO is your only option. That's my thoughts right now. Matt?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that the vast majority of my testing is either done solo online or on Skype, going through leagues with other people. And I think that if you want to test a specific matchup, it can be useful to test on MTGO that way. We're generally still on Skype when we're doing that,
Sure.
but it's easy if you know a specific matchup you want to look at, and also it helps you test a lot of sideboarded games at once. As far as paper testing is useful for other reasons too. Like if you want to see specifically if a certain card is good in a matchup, it's easy to stack your deck a little bit in testing so that you can see if the card is actually effective, if it's worth the slot either in the main or the sideboard. But yeah, I think MTGO is your best bet, and I definitely prefer playing leagues together so that you can hear each other's thoughts. When you're playing heads up, it's often you're getting something out of it definitely, but you're still not getting as much as when you play together because you're only getting your own lines in your head.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're playing together on a league, you get both of your ideas at once, and you can kind of see how somebody else thinks, and it really helps broaden your scope.
I actually have a recommendation. I didn't know this until I started doing this, but my versus videos, the Constructed Clash series that we have on our YouTube channel and on our Patreon with Mason, has actually been super helpful for me. The reason for that is I can actually listen to Mason talk during his lines, and I also very much focus on talking with Mason after. So it's like a very structured playtesting session that we film, and I know it's not time efficient, so don't do that to for the most time value to get the most games in. But it is something that's helped me think about the way other players think and has helped me improve. But kind of like Matt said, for time efficiency, it's leagues together. For specific cards or matchups, I think it's heads up. Michael, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Matt on this one. I think what I would say is if you're learning to if you're trying to learn to play a deck, or just about how to think about your choices with the deck, playing together on Skype,
Yes.
like Magic Online, is really effective because I think you just get the most viewpoints per time unit in that kind of spot.
Yes.
And
by a huge margin.
You're playing real competitive matches where the other players at least believe their decks are playable, and you just generally are going to play pretty reasonable matches of Magic, and a lot of them in a pretty short amount of time. I think if you want to test something very specific, paper is a really good way to go because you can do things like, have the red deck always draw Hazoret or
Yes.
something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that playing against each other, either in paper or on Magic Online or Cognitress or whatever, just whatever's convenient, really, whatever works for you financially, time-wise, otherwise, is a really good way to just get sideboarded games in specific matchups. And I would say that in general, I would want the progression to kind of go from playing leagues together to, if we're trying to figure out a matchup that is particularly tricky, playing games against each other, and then the progression from there, playing games against each other with conditions, kind of in that order. So it's first we're learning about the deck, then we're learning about a matchup, then we're learning about specific cards in a specific matchup.
I agree with that 100%. Cool. Thank you so much for the question, Brian. I hope that answered your question. I do have a request. So, pretty often, Patreon questions will come to me directly, just to help the discussion and help other patrons. I do post a Patreon thread on patreon.com/ccmtg. If you're going to ask questions, please post to that thread so that other patrons can see it before the questions come onto the podcast. Because questions like this, I actually think are really cool to source as a group. And I think that a lot of the questions that we get are this way. I know how much easier it is to message me personally. I know that I'm super responsive. But I actually do think there's benefits to that. So if you can do it, please do it. If not, I'm still happy to add them to the show when you message me directly. So, let's go on to our power rankings. So, I want you guys to decide, because I have had a really hard time with power rankings since we started doing them again. Total of 2 weeks, Matt. Total of 2 weeks. But I have realized something extremely quickly, and that is that paper GP results are extremely divergent than SCG and Moto results. And I personally, if we do the power rankings this week, I'm happy to talk about both, but I would just prefer to talk about the GPs.
So that's interesting that you say that. Give me 1 second so I can pull up the power rankings, but I remember looking at them and noticing that they were both Ziffy. I didn't notice that there was a discrepancy in what deck order they were. It looks like the biggest difference is that UB edged out blue-white.
Yeah.
And Stompy made it into the mix.
Yeah. Actually, let's just talk about both. I'm actually going to give... we're going to do this differently this time. I'm going to try this. So I'm going to give with the GP results only, and then add the others. So with the GP results only, we have Grixis with 7 points, Blue-Black Midrange with 10 points, Blue-White Control with 14 points, Mono-Red Wizards with 15 points, Black-Red Aggro with 29 points. When we add everything together, including the SCG Open and the PTQ, we have Stompy with 18 points, Blue-White Control with 21 points, Blue-Black Midrange with 25 points, Mono-Red Wizards with 34 points, Black-Red Aggro with 81 points, and then we have a few notable things that I want to talk about. So, notable decks with 0 points from GPs were just Mono-Red Aggro that weren't Wizards, or mostly Mono-Red, and then Esper Control. The worst performing deck 2 weeks in a row with points at GPs, that's with 4 GPs played, was Green Stompy, whether it was Green Black or Green Blue. Those are GP only results. With the PTQ and the SCG, we had Stompy getting 14 points alone from the team open, Esper getting on the board when it had 0 points before, and then also Esper was the worst performing deck even with the other two included. So, with all that being said, we're talking about, I think, about 7 or 8 decks, which is, I think, what Standard is made up of.
Definitely. I think realistically, you're just basically never going to have more than 7 or 8 justifiable decks in a Standard format.
And I think that's correct. One thing that I want to think about is the complete and total drop-off of a couple of decks. So, Fog would have been the 6th place deck with the GPs, but had basically 0 results outside of the GPs. We have Grixis Control, who got all...
Did it not win the team open?
No. I believe the open was...
It did win the team open.
Oh.
It 100% did, because Jonathan Job won the team open with it.
Oh, well, then I'm just stupid. Maybe it only had 1 in the PTQ is what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, it had just 1 finish in the PTQ.
That's what I'm thinking of. Okay. Either way, we have a significant drop-off into Fairy decks, and then I don't even think there was any Grixis decks in the PTQ, and there might have been 1 on the Open. With Blue-Black Midrange, though, picking up some huge points, 15 points between the two in the Open and the PTQ. So, with the way that we do points, it's 6 points for first, 5 points for second, 4 for top 4, 3 for top 8, and 2 for top 16, and then or top 32, and then 1 for top 64. We had 3 top 16s and 1 top 25 this week for our points. But I just want to talk about decks really quick and kind of talk about Standard going into the RPTQ. So I'll just go one by decks, and then we can just talk about them. So mostly Mono Red got a total of 0 points the entire weekend. This deck did very well last week. This is the deck that Quinn and I played at the PTQ. Matt, what happened?
Well, I think that Hazoret doesn't find itself in as well of a position as it did prior. I think that if you want to go underneath people with sort of aggressive decks, you probably are better served by playing the Flame of Keld Wizard deck. Um, so I think that's basically the tipping point. Like, there's no reason to have a deck between the Red aggro deck and the current format, or the Black Red mid range deck, I guess.
I mean, it's whatever it is that week, right? Like that black red deck is
Right.
always an aggro deck, but it can just be aggressively mid range.
Right.
Michael, what are your thoughts on the mostly mono red or mono red aggro decks?
My guess would be that specific. So you're going to see what's going to happen is you're going to end up in an awkward position this week where there was less fog overall. So black red was probably a better choice in many of the other matchups where the early aggression wasn't as important. And in the matchups where early aggression was important, you were like the mono red wizards deck was able to go under some of the cards that the mostly red decks weren't. In addition, I think playing Peep Scrounger is a huge liability against the wizard deck specifically. So my guess is that that matchup is pretty abysmal for the mostly red variations.
Yeah, one of the things that Quentin and I did this week in the PTQ is neither of us played Scrap Heap Scrounger. We actually were on 0 Scrap Heap Scrounger, just straight mono red, and because of kind of what you're talking about, like Scrap Heap's just kind of a liability. But I still think with all of that Quentin and I made the wrong choice, and a huge reason for that is like you're bad against blue-white control. I think you're bad against blue-black mid-range. And are you even favored against black-red? Like, maybe a teeny tiny bit, but, like, not by enough to make it, like, substantial. And I think you're a dog to mono-red wizards.
So, I agree with that. It's sort of missing the forest for the trees, right? Like,
right.
You've improved some card in the deck, but failed to see that the deck just isn't well positioned anymore.
Exactly. So one of the biggest fall-offs from this week, I mean, last week, obviously, everybody was talking about Esper mid-range, or Esper Control, but Esper Control almost completely falls off, guys, with blue-white taking its place as the Teferi deck, even above Turbo Fog. What is going on here, Matt?
Sorry, were you asking me?
Yeah, I said Matt. I just said it weird.
Okay, fair enough. Well, so I think that the Turbo Fog deck definitely has certain cards that are going to beat it, right? If you play against the cards Insult to Injury and Duress and Doomfall and potentially something as hateful as Lost Legacy enough times, it's just going to be a bad time. We did see Eric Froelich make a top 4 with, a pretty stock version of Fog, but he's also a great Magic player, so
yeah. My power rankings
I'm sure that he played very well.
Yeah, my power rankings are on my laptop, my MacBook. I wish I could pull them up right now to kind of like break down how Turbo Fog got its points, but it was just outside of both. Like, it was not that far away, but I think that Turbo Fog has the same advantages as something like Ban Approach, where it's like it's this very fast fairy deck that's very hard to beat. But when you want to beat it, it's like not that hard.
Well, what I would say about that specifically is that the card Fog is very good if you have enough of them and people aren't expecting it, right? There are a lot of decks that just can't beat Ensnaring Bridge, for example, right? And Fog in enough numbers basically does the same thing.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say what I'm about to say. I was going to say...
There are specific cards that just mostly make Fog not a real thing.
Matt, coming from the guy that literally won a GPT with a losing record with the Fog deck, I can understand.
That's true. I did.
I'm just kidding.
I mean, that being said, I think that the other problem with the Fog deck right now is that you are very, very reliant on Teferi. Like,
yeah.
The deck basically does not function without Teferi.
Did anybody
Whereas most of the other Teferi is just the best card in the deck.
Right.
It's not.
No.
It's not the only card in the deck.
Right. I have a question about that, though. I actually really enjoyed this week's episode of Game. I know Brian didn't day 2 the GP with his sideboard plan. I actually don't know what his 75 consisted of because he didn't make day 2 or didn't do well. But Drake Haven with Haze of Pollen, some of the decisions that Brian made actually made a lot of sense to me. I know he didn't do well, but that actually could be a legitimate way for the Turbo Fog deck to be really good, is if you play a bunch of cyclers and become cycling with Teferi and taking turns. Any thoughts to that, guys?
So we definitely tried that exact thing. We tried playing Drakehavens over the Karns and adding more
Yes.
cyclers to the deck.
Yes.
The problem is that all the cards with cycling suck. That's the long and short of it.
Okay.
Cast outs
That's
were
not-
pretty good,
cast
but
out is
probably
great,
not
the
in the
rest
numbers
is
you
good.
play. Yeah, and the problem we were having is that you'd win games pretty easily when you drew Drakehaven on 3.
Sure. But when you drew it late,
but
it doesn't matter
you
because
just
you don't
very
have enough...
much you became a Drakehaven deck, right? Like it's the same problem that I have with all the other Drakehaven decks, which is Drakehaven's completely broken, but every card that has cycling is kind of bad.
No, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like, I think that the reason that blue-white Drakehaven is remotely playable is because it is a blue-white control deck with Drakehaven, whereas this is like splitting up literally 3 different decks. So what you're saying, even though what Brian's saying makes sense in my head, like what you're saying makes sense too, right? It's like, do I actually have a way to do this thing without just... Go ahead.
Think of how hard you end up having to go on cycling cards, though, in Drakehaven. And now, imagine that one of your cyclers is 3 mana, so Haze of Pollen is
Right.
like...
That's
only-
actually
it's
the
not really a cycler
weakness,
for
right?
Drakehaven.
Is that it costs 4 mana to make a Drake with Haze of Pollen, which is like a pretty big weakness.
And, like, we're not playing, like, Abandoned Sarcophagus. Like, the cycling decks go so deep on the cycling theme for it to work. I really... We tried it because I thought it might be good, because I had this idea on, like, Monday, and it just wasn't.
So let's move on to Stompy really quick. So this is the worst performing deck for the last 2 weeks at GPs, by a pretty significant margin. But this deck makes up huge points of the SCG Open. Guys, what is going on? Is it... so I'll just give my opinion first. I believe that Stompy is unplayable. In the current iteration that is. I'm not saying that you can't change cards. I'm not saying you can't make it work. Obviously, the number of games that you win, going turn 1 Llanowar Elf into turn 2 Sealy Champion is huge. Like, you can't beat that with most decks in the format. But other than that, like, the deck has just been bad. And the results show that. However, it's something that you're playing right now, Michael.
I think that Stompy is probably the least iterated on deck in the format. I think that basically no one has actually tried basically anything with regards to actually playing different cards in the Stompy deck.
I'm not
And
gonna lie.
I think
I thought about trying to play a Steel Leaf Stompy Winding Constrictor deck for this RPDQ.
sure, I think something like that could be totally fine. It's like Jade Light Ranger, but it always
Yes,
hits
But
things.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And it makes your Llanowar Elves actually good. I don't think that's
Yes.
crazy. I would say that there are a lot of Stompy for a deck that has never been anything more than like decent. Feels like it has a lot of sacred cows. Like everyone's trying to play 4 Blossoming Defense and a bunch of Galtas, but it's not like anyone's really been winning tournaments with those cards. So
No,
why are we so obsessed with
Outside of the SCG
playing four
circuit,
of them?
nobody's actually ever won with Stompy.
I mean, it's done fine at Pro Tours, but it's a little bit unclear to me why the lists have been so settled up until this weekend, at least. Andrew Beckstrom's list was pretty off the wall, and there was an article on Channel Fireball, I think by Bobby Fortinelli, about the deck he won the PTQ in Orlando with last weekend, which was playing like main deck Cartouche of Knowledge and like has a whole bunch of wild stuff going on. And I think that I don't necessarily know that either list is perfect, but I think being willing to try new things gives a deck, like, we know that Blossoming Defense in Galta isn't good enough. So
Right.
if you're interested in playing Stompy, I would not play those cards.
Let's, Matt, do you have anything to add to this, or should we move on?
It makes a lot of sense to me. I was curious to see what you guys had to say about it. Honestly, I wasn't sure why there was the disparity between Grand Prix and SCGs. I don't know that we covered that well, but that's a really hard question to answer, honestly.
Some of it's
think
just
the
dumb
fact that-
luck, right?
No, hold
I
on.
mean,
I think the fact that Michael and I are both saying, like, you need to, like, be willing to change your mind about something. Like, yeah, Vinemare was broken week 1. Okay, we're over that. Blossoming Defense was broken week 1. Okay, we're over that. Now, how do we iterate on this deck that clearly has power level, but nobody's trying to do anything with?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately
Sure,
this
I
is
think that's
true in
fine,
every
but
deck.
that
You
doesn't
just
really.
have to be willing to change. As far as why it's doing better on SCG than
I covered this in the Constructed Critics group, though. Like, it is not about the decks you play on the SCG circuit right now, and it's why I don't trust SCG results. With all of these events being team events, the makeup of your team is super important, and you see a lot of players who are capable of like the silver gold status, like doing very well on the SCG circuit, and it's odd. Like these players are players that like most of us are pretty good friends with, right? Like Tannen, Job, Rudy. Like these are players that we know that like they've all played Pro Tours. Like they're these like silver, bronze, gold grinders that like obviously like they make way more money playing these SCG circuits, and they get to play against players playing SCG circuits. And I am perfectly okay being the person willing to admit that like it's funny. I did a poll this week on Twitter, and I said, "What is harder, day one of a GP or an SCG Classic?" What do you think won?
I'm sure SCG Classic won somehow.
It did not. It was a blowout.
No? Okay.
It was something like 89% of people voted for day one of a GP is harder than an SCG Classic. So I think we all know which is harder. I mean, among our friend group, the number of people that have just cashed basically every SCG they played in is extremely high, and we're just like a bunch of PBDQ grinders.
My inclination is that Stompy probably has put up results also because if you aren't that familiar with what to play, it's like a very safe deck, right? If you have a good Modern and a Legacy player and you're just, some third guy on a team that is very good, like I could basically write you out a mulligan rule sheet in 5 minutes and I think you could play Stompy to a non-disastrous record.
Matt, I know that I kind of interrupted you there. Did I answer your question, or do you still wonder?
No, the question was somewhat answered, and I forgot that they were doing only team events right now in the SCG circuit. I do think that team results are to be taken with a grain of salt. Honestly, if you're watching team coverage and you can see a deck that you think is performing well, that's usually a much better indicator than what actually finishes high.
Yeah. To be fair, I would also say this about your own playtesting.
Yes.
If you think something is good and you're not winning with it, play it anyways because you're probably right.
Sure.
Let's talk about mid range for a second. So I think the last deck out on mid range was Green Black Snake, which I think is interesting that it's starting to get points because I think close to 0 people are playing it. But the two decks that did well are Grixis and Blue Black mid range. With Blue Black mid range going all the way up to 25 points after the PPTQ results. I also know that multiple nationals, I think I saw 3 different nationals won by Blue Black midrange. And I've talked to Quentin about this a lot. He's a former host of this podcast. And I need your guys' help because Quentin and I think there's basically 0 reason not to play Nicol Bolas in this deck, even if that's your only red card. Like your mana is actually basically the same because your mana is still so bad in blue-black. I need help, guys.
So, I don't think your mana is bad in blue-black anymore because you're not trying to play Gifted Aetherborn.
Biggest question... Tell me about that.
The biggest question is how many Field of Runes you want to play, and I think any more than 1 is not free, and more than 2 is actively on the aggressive side. That being said...
Hold on, the blue-black deck's just splashing Nicol Bolas literally only played 1 Field of Ruin.
Right, but
they're playing Field of Ruin and Nicol Bolas?
Yeah, I think Field of Ruin Nicol Bolas is a dangerous path to go down. I think more than that, whether or not you like Nicol Bolas is kind of... It's more a question of fundamentally how you feel this deck is positioning itself, rather than whether or not Nicol Bolas is a pretty good Magic card.
I'm super biased here. I think that I'm 13-2 in matches with Grixis midrange, and I've never played blue-black mid-range specifically on Arena, which is where I do most of my playtesting right now. But on MTGO, in both friendly and competitive leagues, I basically 2-3'd or 3-2'd every league I've ever played with the deck. I don't even see where this deck is good. I think it has a bad blue-white matchup. I think that it has I think it is good against black-red. I will say that. I think that, like, if I was to pick between Grixis and blue-black to play against black-red, I would pick blue-black. But, like, I think it's bad against control. I think you have a horrible Wizards matchup. I think that, like, your matchup against green-black is just as bad as the Grixis, if not worse, depending on whether or not they're playing cut ribbons. And I think that, like, you have a horrible control. Like, any Teferi deck just crushes you. I don't get it. I don't get why this deck is doing well, but I know I'm wrong because it's just crushing it.
I think you're just looking at matchups as being way more polarized than they ever are. There's basically no such thing as an 80-20 matchup. There's almost no such thing as a 70-30 matchup. I think that, like, when you play decks that specifically side up or down, the real secret is with a deck like blue-black mid-range, most of your games are going to come down to actual game actions.
That has not been my experience. Like, I could not beat Stompy with blue-black, which is a good reason for its uptick. And
yeah, I think Stompy is probably a pretty bad matchup.
Yeah, and I think Wizards is a bad matchup too.
I don't know that I would agree on that one.
Tell me about that.
So you have a lot of cheap interaction. I mean, after board, you're probably looking at, like, Essence Extraction, multiple negates, multiple Essence Scatters, full set of Fatal Pushes. I've seen people playing Fungal Infection. From the Wizard side, you can win a game that goes long, but Torrential Gearhulk with Vraska's Contempt or Essence Extraction will pretty firmly slam the door shut.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the blue-black deck is a favorite to make it to 6 in mostly every game.
How many Essence Extraction do you think are correct in blue-black mid-range right now?
Usually 2 in the sideboard, plus multiple Hostage Takers, plus 4 Fatal Pushes in the main deck, and at least 1 Fungal Infection in the board.
I think a lot of the things that you're saying right now. So, I was playing a little bit of Devil's Advocate. I've seen some lists in blue-black that I really like. Like, to the point where I'm starting to question myself. However, my results don't indicate what I'm thinking, and so I kind of wanted a defense there. Matt, what are your...
Pretty much, just one last thing. I pretty much always trust what I'm thinking over what my results say.
Ah, that's an interesting...
I think trusting what your results say, you don't know enough about your opponent's deck makeup for your results to be as meaningful as you want them to be.
It's also almost impossible to get the sample size you actually need, right?
Oh, it's basically 0%.
Right.
Yep. You want to play games, I think, to try to find the right feel, not necessarily to find the right numbers.
Yeah. Matt, any thoughts on this before we move on?
As far as on blue-black mid-range?
And Grixis. We're covering both right now.
Sure. So Grixis and blue-black mid-range are very similar in nature, but the difference is you trade a little bit of consistency, I guess. Just like consistency in your mana base for a little bit of power. The problem with the blue-black deck is that your cards are all very weak on their own, except for potentially Torrential Gearhulk. So you're really winning the game by inches. Like you have to get the most value out of every card. I mean, the Scarab God is powerful, but is it really powerful in any matchup right now? Like I feel like every time I've lost to the Scarab God recently,
well, this is the thing,
or won with the Scarab God, the game has just been over already.
I think that blue-black was probably the best performing deck of the weekend. Like in my opinion, from looking at results, like the number of people that probably played blue-black versus the number of people that like did well with it, I would assume that it and blue-white are the best performing decks. But I think...
I would be surprised if that were true about UB. Having just played the GP, like I saw a lot of people on blue-black control. And a lot of great players scrubbed out with it.
Okay. So, wait. I'm talking about mid-range, though.
Yeah. Matt mid-range.
Oh, okay. Okay. Just... I was...
No, what did I say?
You just said control.
Oh, sure. I meant UB mid-range.
Okay. Then I would just accept that I'm wrong. Because... from like going into the weekend, we even had John Stern literally tell us on this podcast that that style of mid-range deck in the form of Grixis made a lot of sense. So it's like,
Sure. He said it made a lot of sense on the predicate that black-red mid-range was going to be on the downtick because he said the matchup's really bad.
okay.
But that was clearly not true this weekend. Like black-red was everywhere.
I just want to say, black-red got significantly less than half the points available this week.
So
Sure.
I would also
it
say
still
that
did do twice as well as the next best deck, though.
Hey, I'm just saying
think-
what happened. You're
surprisingly, UB actually lines up a lot better than Grixis against red-black.
That's true.
Because of multiple main deck Essence Scatters, which is probably the best card you can actually play against red-black, and then Gear Hulk is like really, really good against red-black.
The Trenchels definitely help a lot.
Somebody messaged. Well,
So
can we go on to the blue
it's funny
white?
because actually Nicol Bolas is good against red-black as well,
Yes,
but I
it
think
is.
the blue-black package overall is better than the Grixis package.
I'd like to actually talk about the things that you just talked about. One of the things that people in our Constructed Credits group know that I had this weekend a 17-0 record with Blue White Control between MTGO and MTG Arena, and some people just messaged me about Blue White deck lists like crazy this week. And one of the lists that came up, Mason messaged me about, which was, I think it was Oliver 2's list, which was 2 Gear Hulk, 3 Glimmers, and then like normal Blue White stuff. I think 1 Forsake the Worldly in the main. And I told him, I was like, this is just a great list. Like, the amount that Gear Hulk is good right now, Essence Scatter is good right now, which he's playing 3 of. Forsake the Worldly might actually be main deck playable right now when you really think about it. Like, this list is just great. I think that Blue-White is the most interesting deck in the format. I think, personally, that Grixis midrange, I talked to Quinn about this today, is the best position deck right now. But I think that Blue-White Control is the highest performing deck according to its occupancy of the metagame. And I'm curious what you guys think as far as, like, I mean, Michael just listed some cards in blue-black midrange that are really good, but Blue-White Control gets to play those cards, and also gets to play Teferi, which is the best card in Standard. So, like, where does Blue-White Control sit in the metagame for you guys?
Do you want me to go first?
You want to take
Sure.
this one, Michael?
Yeah,
Sure.
go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I would say that, so like specifically the biggest innovation that I know Oliver 2 came up with this list with help from Nathan Stoor and
His
John Rotham.
his sideboard, by the way, which is like 3, it's 3 Lyra, 3 Baral, 3 Walking Ballista, a
and then
bunch of
just
negates,
some-
and like some good stuff, is like complete gas. It does the exact same thing that my sideboard does, but gets to play Baral. It's very strong.
So the main actual like unusual choice that they've made though is they're playing no sweepers other than Settle the Wreckage in the 75.
Yes.
And I would say that typically what happens with blue-white is you can make these kind of choice. Like, there are 2 ways to build blue-white. You can build it to be slightly more mediocre in general, or you can try to beat a perceived metagame for a weekend and play a more exploitable list. And I think that, like, choosing to play, like, all 4 Settle the Wreckages, if that becomes the stock thing, it's very exploitable. And I think that blue-white has a little bit of the same issue, not to the same extent, obviously, but a little bit of the same issue that, like, Turbo Fog has, where when the lists are really known and things start sort of getting samey, like everyone's sort of on the same exact lists, it becomes very exploitable, just like because a card like Settle the Wreckage is very exploitable and the reliance on Teferi is very exploitable.
I've actually had
But
this experience.
When things are moving around more, you can really, really make a good call where you like decide Fumigate is a lot worse than Settle the Wreckage this week, so we're going to play a blue-white deck that instead of being stock is like, you know, even just a few percentage points better in a couple of key matchups is a huge difference.
So one of the things that I will post this deck list in the critics group tonight because Matt wants to test it. But one of the things that I would say is that Michael's basically exactly right here. So one of the things that Oliver 2 did is his sideboard is gas. Like, his sideboard probably makes up a huge percentage of Oliver 2's wins over this weekend. And The reason is because he's like playing this aggro. He's playing a tempo game in his sideboard. He sideboards into a tempo deck, which is the same thing that I've been doing with Blue Eye Control. And in this metagame, it's very good because like Blue Black can't beat a lot of it. Mid range specifically. Stompy is in my opinion a good matchup. We'll get into that later. And like your bad matchups are like matchups that like you actually can't beat with a color combination, which is pretty important. Which is like Mono Red Wizards is unwinnable. This new Mono Blue aggro deck is actually quite bad for Blue White, and the reason is because like they play Spell Pierce, which is basically good against your entire deck.
Sure, and the Lyra. So what I would say is your babes. So for anyone who just isn't quite understanding like fully what's happening here, what's basically going to happen is a lot of the time you're going to side into like baby historic.
Yes.
Right. Like
even if it's
you're like,
it doesn't matter which side you're on, right? You could be playing like the Knight package. You could be playing like the Walking Ballista package, but like you're gonna sideboard into a creature deck.
Right.
A lot of the time.
The secret then is that your opponent isn't going to have enough removal spells, and when you play 2 torrentials in the main, you have enough sideboard space to actually get to a respectable number of creatures. So what they're doing is in the matchups where the expensive permission isn't as good, or where various parts of the deck aren't as good, they can cut the bad parts for just like a little bit more of a proactive strategy that their opponent is likely not that well equipped to answer. And this is the kind of thing that like if your opponents don't know what you're doing, you're basically going to maul a bunch of them with this kind of a plan. And I know that Rossum top 16'd, I think Stuart top 32'd, and obviously 2 took second. So, like, those 3 collectively did extremely well with, I think, basically the exact same 75.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I mean, it's not new technology for a control deck to board in a bunch of creatures when their opponent boards out all their removal, but it is still just as effective as it has ever been.
Yeah.
The problem is like oftentimes like Michael said, you do board to a respectable amount of creatures, but not so many that like your opponent can realistically justify leaving in removal.
So
cards like Doomfall are very powerful because they have split modes. But like honestly, you could side in Baral's face up, and your opponent's not going to leave in fatal pushes. Like
one of the things
not going to happen.
that I found really to be effective is like. So even after looking at these lists, and I'll just say my opinion on Blue White going into this RPTQ, is I still wouldn't adopt Oliver 2's list. And the reason is because the Hexproof of Knight plus History of Banali gives me a couple of things. One, the number of times that somebody has had to kill my token to turn off my History of Banali is way too high. Plus the ability of Knight of Grace to just have protection from black removal spells has just been so high that's kind of still where I'm at. But I think that one of the things that is undervalued with Blue White is that it's the most consistent Teferi deck without ever being the most powerful Teferi deck. I think it's very clear that Turbo Fog is the most powerful Teferi deck. I think that even Esper Control at times gets like Teferi gives you so much card advantage that you don't really need Pull from Tomorrow, Glimmer Genius, that kind of stuff. Like, you can 1-for-1 and just win with Teferi or win with Scarab God. But Blue Eye Control just does this thing where it's like, I'm just a good deck, right? And I'm going to just try and win by being a good deck. And I think that's kind of where I would end with Blue White.
Just out of curiosity, so if you're playing some number of Knight of Graces and History of Knowledge, do you like an additional creature like Walking Ballista or Lyra as a supplement to those, or even Baral, or do you think that those alone are...
I have Lyras. I board in Lyras in almost every matchup that I board in those in, and I also have a Gideon in the main. So this is something that was talked about with some of our patrons who asked me for Blue White deck lists. We talked about this a little bit last week. We had really good results with my Blue White deck across GPs and Nationals. But in addition to that, something that I learned at the RPTQ as well as on Magic Online was that you really want a win condition to actually be able to activate your searches. What is the flip side search called?
That search can find.
Yeah, sure. So you can search for, and so a lot of people turn to Approach, right? But I actually have found that Gideon is good in more matchups than Approach. So I have a Gideon in the main right now, which frees up extra sideboard slots. We actually had a listener who played my deck, played Gideon in the sideboard over a history to have the exact same effect, basically. So I think that Gideon is important when you want to do this plan. But honestly, if you actually look at the number of cards for the sideboard plan for Oliver 2's deck, he actually has the right... I think he has the right number because of Torrential Gearhulk in the main.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear they're not all on exactly the same list, so it's clear that, you know, there was some debate as to it, like the exact right number of cards or whatever. But I think that it's an interesting plan, and especially when your opponents aren't respecting it, it's just a really easy way to win games.
Let's move on.
My guess is he played a lot of sideboarded games that were not close.
Oh, that's how... The number of times where, like, I'll lose game one to the fact that I'm a control deck on the draw, and, like, I'll board into the other deck on the play and, like, keep in my syncopates with, like, knights and stuff, and then, like, I'll actually, on the draw, change my deck again, has been super powerful for me. I don't know if... I mean, I would assume that Baral comes in specific matchups, whereas Nata Grace and History are just good in, like, lots of matchups. So I don't know, but, like, for me, the play versus the draw has been super important sideboarding there. Let's move on to Mono Red Wizards, though. I'd like to talk about this deck before we get into Black Red. This is a deck that I've been touting as good for about 3 weeks. I think it's good versus Control. I think that it's good versus the green decks, which I don't think is true for the other red decks. Michael actually has a disagreement on this, so I'm excited to hear his opinion. I think it's good versus the mid-range decks. Like this, however, to Matt's point that we talked about this week, I think this deck falls apart so much I can't play it. So, guys, what is happening with Mono Red Wizards? Is this the real deal? Because, man, was it the real deal this weekend? And if it is, like, what's actually correct?
Well, I would say that it is the real deal. But the problem is that it might not be the real deal for you. If you get enough people playing it, it does have the best draws in Standard. I think that if you're drawing well, you're just going to win against almost anything. And if you get enough people playing the deck, then somebody's going to be able to do that enough times to make a top 8 or even a win. The problem with that is that if you're winning 75% of your games and they're specifically based on how well you draw but not anything else, then I mean 75% is like an insane win percentage, right? But like you can't actually win a tournament winning 75% of your games if it's exactly 75%.
Michael?
Does that make any sense?
I sort of understand what you're saying. What you're saying is that it's not about matchups or deck building, it's just about drawing the right cards.
Well, can we actually
Right.
talk about what Matt said for a second? Because, like, I've talked to Danny about this a little bit, and it's like, I think that most of us have, like, a 70% win percentage in PPTQs, right? Like, it's pretty, like, that's just what a good player will do in PPTQs, but at the end of the day, like, you won't win a PPTQ where you have a 70% win percentage. You'll make top 8, like, on all of those PPTQs, but you actually won't win any of them. You actually have to break that mold.
Yeah, or not necessarily, certainly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Unless
right.
you like,
it's 70% including some run bads here and there.
Yeah,
The secret
exactly.
Is that, what I would say is that Flame of Keld is incredibly just high variance in general. It's like when your good hands are great, your bad hands are bad, and
I played this deck for I think 6 competitive whatever they're called on Arena, and I went 3-2, 3-2, 2-2, 2-2, 5-1, something else, and was like, this deck is horrible. But I actually don't believe that. I actually don't believe it's horrible, because like the games that I won weren't close, the games that I lost weren't close, and I don't think this deck has something in between.
I think that's true. I think your green matchups are pretty bad. Some of the sideboards that you see, I think, specifically reflect that. I'm looking at one that took 6th place in Providence from Kane Reinhard, and he is playing Blood Rage Brawler and Reckless Rage in his sideboard, which I would imagine are both concessions to specifically that matchup.
I'm a little interested in this. So this is actually one of the decks that I had a positive win percentage against on Arena specifically. So Michael, why was I beating the green decks if they're a bad matchup for me?
Well, because your sample size is too small.
I would agree with that.
I mean, the secret, like we were talking about, is that when you actually like nut curve and draw the Flame of Keld at the end of it, you will beat everything, and the games will
not be
feel
close.
Like it'll feel what basically my experience with this deck has been. Every matchup feels great sometimes, and every matchup feels unwinnable sometimes.
That's
and
how
the
I
only
felt.
difference is how well you draw.
That's how I felt. And that's one of my weaknesses in Magic, is like I don't know how to even play these style of decks, and we'll get into this a little bit later. But before we get into that, I'd like to just move on to Black Red. I don't think there's a lot to talk about in Mono Red Wizards. I think that we've really covered it in like your deck is a glass cannon. It might be the glass cannon deck of Standard, to be honest. But
I don't even know that it's a glass cannon. It's not fragile to your opponents. It's like an old musket. It just blows up sometimes when you try to shoot it.
Well, let's talk about Black Red. So,
Yeah.
I've only been doing power rankings again for 2 weeks, but Black Red took a significant less percentage of the metagame share this week than it did last week. I want to talk about something that we talked about with John Stern last week because I want Michael's opinion. Michael, I believe Magic players have gotten lazy. I believe that this is the best deck in Standard, but it's not the best deck by the margin at which people play it, and that the numbers at which people playing this is unreasonable.
So, I don't agree with your logic. If something is the best deck in Standard, why would you not play it?
So, because I believe that this deck has very clear weaknesses. I don't believe that this has a good blue-white matchup. I don't believe this has a good Stompy matchup. I don't believe this has a good Grixis or blue-black matchup. However, I think that it has a reasonable matchup against most of these decks.
So, I think that being said, it's pretty clear why. I mean, a lot of really good players continue to play this deck, and I don't think it's because they're lazy, because they're cautious.
Sure. Would you agree with me, though? Like, this deck doesn't have horrible matchups. It has, you're not favored, but, like, you can win it.
No, this deck is, like, just a different flavor of blue-black mid-range.
Okay.
It's just, like, red-black mythic rares.
No, I think that it is literally a aggressively slanted mid-range deck. It reminds me of, like, Jund and Alara block, because that's how bad our mana is right now. So, like, this is the deck that we get to do that with.
This is the safest deck by a substantial margin. There's no way you bring this deck to an event and go away from the event saying, oh man, that deck I played just really wasn't close to good enough. Right? Like, if I just grab Logan Nettles' list...
So hold on. Do you believe that this deck deserves over 50% of the metagame share?
So I would say that metagame share is a function of a format being something between kind of stale and solved, not a function of how good the deck actually is. I think if we know with certainty that it's the best deck, the longer that it's the best deck, the more its metagame share will grow, and that doesn't matter what its are. Okay. If something is both like the safest and the best deck, you're just going to get a huge proportion of people playing it because it's safe and good.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think we've seen that in basically every format where that's ever been true. Like, look at Grixis Delver, for instance, at the end of Legacy. I mean, it was the best deck, but not by so much that it should have been, 75% of the actual decks that were being played. But yeah, I agree. I was going to make a very similar point to what Michael was saying, which is that if I know this is the best deck, even if it's the best deck by 1%, why am I playing anything else? I don't think that's laziness. I think that's discipline.
Maybe I'm wrong here. I think that I think that Black Red is the best deck.
I think it. So, and also, to get back on this point, I think it's hard to say that Black Red has bad matchups against every other one of the other best decks and is somehow still the best deck. I think one of those two things has to be wrong.
Hold on. Did we say
even if you're 45% against blue white, blue black, Grixis, Stompy?
The secret is that you're just really.
It's really hard for me to believe that would be the best deck.
Close. I think that you're probably.
I think it's that your margins are so close that this is the deck that allows your skill to outplay your opponents and to understand matchups more than any other deck in the format because your matchups are so close. I think that it's fine if a deck like is there really a format where Jund is like actually above 50% against like most of the decks? I don't think so. I think that like it's usually actually a dog against most decks if they play completely optimally. And what actually happens is like they don't actually understand what the match is about, and you gain edges. And I think that Black Red does the same thing in the standard format.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's better than you're giving it credit for, but I do think that there's something to be said for like, if I have 1,000 games with Black Red and my opponent picked Blue Black this because it was the new flavor of the week, who do you think is favored if it's a 50-50 matchup if we both play ideally?
It's funny because like if you just think about like what we're saying, and this is something that I notice on podcasts, articles, matchups, Twitter conversations all the time, is like I don't actually think that any of us are that far off on like how good Black Red is. But the difference between like 2% for all of us is like a pretty huge gap.
The secret is that Black Red is very good, but its dominance is in numbers of like players playing a good deck
that are
not
also
a few
good
players playing a broken deck.
Right.
This isn't Turbo Fog at the Pro Tour. No one has an 82% win percentage with Black Red.
Right.
But it's like if you show up with a good configuration of Black Red, you're not going to walk away from an event thinking, "Oh man, my deck wasn't good enough."
Yes, I think we all agree on that. Cool. Let's move on. So, well, actually, before we do, we should pour one out for Esper Control, which just did horribly this weekend. Matt, why did Esper do so bad?
Well, I mean, like Michael and I were talking about last week, that I think that Blue-White is just a better deck than Esper right now. I think that there's so many matchups where your 1-for-1 removal just doesn't line up as well as you'd hope, and you actually need these catch-up cards like Settle the Wreckage to pull you back. I've heard people say that they don't like the mana base in Esper, but I think that that's mostly nonsense. I think, back to your point of splashing for Nicol Bolas, splashing for Teferi is even easier than that, right? Because you're not trying to curve out.
It's way easier, especially since you're not trying to play like double white cards on 4, like Settle the Wreckage, right? Like it's like I'm just playing like this blue-black deck that eventually needs to get to white mana, and it's actually very rare, no matter what Teferi deck you're playing on, outside of Turbo Fog, where like you're just trying to jam your Teferi as soon as possible, because like outside of Turbo Fog, you don't have enough mana to like cast your spells once you cast your Teferi. You're trying to cast it like maybe a turn late, maybe 2 turns late, and Esper does a good job of that. The problem is like you just fall behind after that.
I think because you're playing no sweepers, any mana base inefficiencies are really magnified.
Sure.
Like, so let's say Grix is mid-range, right? Our opponent plays a bunch of Soulscar Mages, but we play a Nicol Bolas, and now those Soulscar Mages aren't magic cards anymore, right? We played a pseudo-sweeper.
Sure.
Now, in Esper, kill every single creature my opponent plays the entire game. So anytime I play a tap land, there's a much bigger cost to that because we don't have any sweepers and we don't have any cards that are just going to bury our opponents.
Because
I think that, like, although you can say the mana isn't bad, the mana wouldn't be bad if you had catch-up cards. The mana is not good enough for a deck that literally has to 1-for-1 every single card your opponent plays.
I think that the important thing here is, like, Esper's weakness is, like, it's trying to catch up on the back of Torrential Gearhulk, and while that can be good a lot of the time, Torrential Gearhulk is like a very powerful magic card, it actually doesn't add up to the same amount of quick interaction, right? Like, giving the 6 mana untapped in this deck is actually kind of hard.
It's just exploitable, right? It's like I just think Esper is more exploitable because its game plan is much more linear. You know what your Esper opponent always has to do to get back in a game that they're behind in, and the answer is literally kill every creature you play. So the play patterns that are good against them are much more clear, and when people come to tournaments with decks with that matchup in mind, I think it's just a poor choice.
All right, we have the RPTQ this weekend. Matt, what are your top 3 decks?
Right now, Probably red black by a good margin. I might try the Turbo Fog deck with less fogs and hour promises. I don't know. You like that deck kind of, Michael, right?
Yeah, I played that at the PTQ, and lost a win in for top 8, but it felt like
The
it
other
was
deck I would
okay.
consider would be blue white control. So
So for me, it's blue eye control number one. I think Grixis control number two. I don't or Grixis mid range. Sorry, I don't know what the makeup is like, what the removal suite is, but I think that like not. I said this earlier. I didn't hear anything from you guys that like made me convinced that like the splashing of Nicol Bolas wasn't worth it. Um, so whatever that looks like, and then I'm a little interested in Green Black Snake because it's like my weakness. Um, but I don't know what Michael played at this PTQ, and now I'm interested. Michael, what are your top 3 decks going?
This deck is like maybe worth exploring. I don't know how good it is, but it's like
Did you see
Bant,
the? Did you?
it's Bant approach, but you cut approach for Nexus. That's basically the deck.
Oh, interesting. Because the video, I need to check to see if it's up after this podcast or probably before this podcast. But like, we did a video with Grixis mid range versus Bant Fog with approaches with for Contracted Clash this week, and like I was like, man, these Hour of Promises are like really powerful, but like,
Yeah, what I would say is that like against like UB mid, against the non-red decks, Hour of Promise is a legitimate threat. I killed a bunch of people with like hostile deserts and Hashep oases
okay,
as Hour of Promise. It can also get Field of Ruins to kill your opponent's search for Azkanas or Bloodfasts if they flip. It can get Ipnu Rivulets if you think you can mill your opponent out if they're like
Done that,
playing
yeah.
like, just to fairies as a win condition. Uh, it gives you a little bit like it just gives you higher threat density.
sure.
So there were some cool things about it. In retrospect, given the fact that I played it cold without having ever played a game with it before.
Where'd you get the list?
Well, I started whistling that was on Magic Online, and then I just changed cards until I thought it looked better. So it
Cool.
was very unscientific.
Well, I'd be happy to try it out on stream this week. So shoot me a list.
It was kind of cool.
What are the other
but
two decks?
That deck would probably be like a distant third at this point to probably blue white or maybe Stompy. I think Stompy has kind of a poor red black matchup, but I feel pretty happy with it in a lot of the other matchups. And I have a couple of ideas still.
One of the things that I find really interesting, and I don't know this week to cover it, but like the divergence in people's opinions about the Stompy red black matchup specifically, depending on the cards you're playing. And I think that after Matt's always improving moment and like kind of this topic, I think next week will probably just be a topic on like understanding matchups according to cards and like why cards are important. So hopefully we can come up with a show for that next week. But let's go on to our training grounds. Our training grounds is the Points Podcast. It's brought to you by Oasis Games. This week we're going to talk about understanding your strengths and weaknesses, and we're doing something really weird. We're actually going to talk about each other, and what we're going to do is we're going to go around for the strengths of each person, written by each other as well as ourselves, and then following that we're going to go over weaknesses. And we're just going in order of my screen. So Matt, we're going to go first. And let's just go over Matt's strengths according to person. We'll go myself, then Michael, then Matt. So the one that I have written down for Matt. Oh man, I need to find it now. Yeah, so I have the biggest strength for Matt for me is understanding your role and being able to understand where you are supposed to be in a macro archetype matchup. So this is actually something that I've noticed from Matt from like block constructed testing from like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Is something that Matt's very good at that I don't quite understand is like how to approach a macro mirror matches. So whether you're a mid-range mirror match, whether you're a control mirror match, whether you're an aggro mirror match, I actually think one of Matt's great strengths is to like understand like where to be from there. Like I don't care what the color combinations are. I don't care what the the individual cards are. I think Matt actually has a really good understanding of like when I'm playing versus somebody who's playing the same macro archetype as I am. Where do I go from here? Michael, have you witnessed this from Matt?
Yeah, I think Matt specifically is good at playing mirrors generally. But what I listed as a strength for Matt was actually getting the minutia of a game correct. I just like this is something that I've really noticed just because we actually play a lot together and we'll kind of debate about lines. And I think Matt is very good at like finding percentage points in small things where like tapping your mana one way or trying to represent something or trying not to represent something and just like being cognizant of exactly what is happening in kind of small picture ways. And I think that's a really challenging thing to do, and it's a really challenging thing to do over long events, just like because it's very mentally taxing to sort of always be like trying to think about the little things, and I think that's something that's really good at.
Matt, before we talk about the two that we just listed for you, I'd like you to say the strength that you had for yourself.
So the strength that I had for myself
is
sorry, let me find it really
fast. I can get it for you. It's playing what I think are the odds.
Sure, yeah, I see. Playing what the odds are, playing what I think of the odds for the matchup, even if it's a very important match to me. And basically, what this means is that I kind of keep emotion aside. Like I will, if I see a line that I think is a higher percentage, even if it feels bad when you lose that way. Like there are certain ways that feel worse to lose, right? Like if you have to keep a one-lander on the draw or whatever, it feels a lot worse to lose that way because you didn't actually get to play Magic, right? But if I feel like that one land on the draw on 6 is going to give me a better chance to win the game than a 5, I'm pretty good at separating out emotion and dealing with that kind of stuff later.
Let's go in order of the ones that were just listed for you. Michael and I both mentioned your ability to play macro mirror matches really well. Like what do you think gives you that edge? Like what is the thing that you think about? And it could be the strength that you listed for yourself that gives you the ability to like understand like this is important in this mirror match.
Well, oftentimes in mirror matches, I mean, it really depends on the mirror match, honestly. I think that I will generally take mirror matches individually. Like, I honestly just enjoy playing mirror matches, I think, more than most people. So that helps a lot. So
I agree with that. I think you like legitimately love it.
I think the biggest thing, I got to talking to you versus talking to other people is that most people will like list playing mirrors as a negative. People will be like, "Oh, yeah. I didn't want to play this because I didn't want to play mirrors." And I think just not shying away from that is a really big.
I think you actually love it, which is not true of other Magic players.
Yeah, the most enjoyable matches of Magic I got to play this weekend were like in the red black mirror, and one of them was against Yuya, who I know is much better than me. So. But that was one of the best matches of Magic I've gotten to play in a long time.
So like what causes that?
So I think that helps a lot.
What makes you comfortable in a mirror match?
It's really hard to say. I don't know. I feel like I've actually just always been pretty comfortable in mirror matches.
Do you think Caw-Blade caused this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I started out testing a lot of mirror matches for a number of reasons. It wasn't just Caw-Blade though. I think that I tested mirror matches for other reasons other than that. I think I tested a lot of mirrors even when I was playing kitchen table Magic, just because I wanted to see, I wanted to be better than my friends, specifically. And I think when you're playing different decks, it gets lost in translation somewhere. So in order to prove myself in this game that we were playing, I like to have us both on the same playing field to start.
The next biggest strength for you was listed by Michael, which was understanding the minutia of a game to get it correct. Identifying specific lines that are more likely to lead to victory, which is almost the same as the one that you listed for yourself, which is like really caring about a line less because of like emotions and more about like this is just the best line.
It's similar, yeah. I think that what Michael's saying is basically I kind of always try to pay attention to every little thing. Like he was saying, like tapping mana appropriately to either represent something or not represent something. Like if you have one mana open, it does something for you, whether it's either representing something that you do have or that you don't have, or not representing something that you might have later. So there are lots of little things like that.
And how was that different than
Self-evaluation is not one of my strong suits, to be honest with you.
It's okay. But speaking of self-evaluation, like, what is the one that you listed for yourself, and why did you list it?
Well, I think I listed this one because honestly, I consider combo decks to be one of my strong suits, which is it's kind of awkward because I really don't enjoy combo mirror matches because combo mirror matches are mostly nonsense.
Sure.
And again, it depends on the combo deck, but like 90% of the time, your combo deck is not going to have ways to interact with the mirror at all. So it's a complete crapshoot. But I really enjoy playing combo decks because it's very much it's a scenario where I can remove myself completely from the actual outcome of the game and try to play what the mathematically best way is. And I think that's something that I've gotten pretty good at over the years. You know, playing decks like Ad Nauseam and like more recently like that. Like it's easy to just, for an example, like I'm playing KCI, right? And I think that my opponent has Spell Queller, but it also looks like I might be dead, like, in a couple of turns or whatever. Now, I can either choose to just jam KCI and say, this guy doesn't have it. Or I can say, if I top deck exactly this, into this, I can actually beat the Spell Queller. So, like, I don't know. I'm better at playing those kind of games, so that's what I identify as my strength.
Matt, I think that you undervalue yourself as a Magic player. But we'll get into your weaknesses later. Let's move on to me. This is actually kind of hard since I'm the host. So what I would like to do is to have you guys just actually say your biggest strength for me, and then I'll respond. So let's start with Matt.
So my strength for Spencer was that you are very good at reading your opponents. This is something I noticed a very long time ago when we first started testing. You just basically always knew what was in my hand, and I don't think that I have a particularly easy face to read. I've certainly been told by people that it's I have a pretty reasonable poker face.
Yeah.
And more than that, having watched you play against other people, like you just basically, even in situations where the card is very weird, you just know what they're going to play.
I do think this is a strength of mine, but I don't have advice for people on this. Because I don't think it's a strength of mine according to, like, skill. I think it's just a talent of mine. I actually don't know. This is something I'm very good at, but I actually don't know how I'm good at it. I wish that I could give advice on this one.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, some of that is intuition, right? Like, I mean, they do have it's about, like, classes on reading people and stuff. But
I think it's like open mana throughout the game, understanding like what could be in their deck, and like it's a factor of things. But like I was good at that before I was good at understanding any of the things that I just said. So I don't have advice on this one other than the fact that, like, just pay attention because I don't think either of you are bad at this thing either. I've personally seen both of you make plays where it's like I don't know how that Matt or Michael knew that he had this thing, but like good on them for this read. I do agree with Matt.
So what I would say about that. What I would say about that specifically is that I'm good at reading a situation, right? Not necessarily my opponent. Like, I can tell if my opponent has something by the way they're playing or how the game is adapted. But I think you're able to just, like, kind of read your opponent's soul.
I agree with you. I'm trying to break this down because I don't know how to give advice about this.
That's okay, though. I mean, I think it's fair to say that some of your strengths are just, like, some of the things you're better or worse at are things that you're just going to be better or worse at. Like, not everyone has the potential to be the same Magic player.
The thing is like, this is... have any of you ever played, like, Scum or The Great Dalmoody or, like, those two games?
Sure.
I have not.
Okay, so, like... So both of these games are this... They're the same game, but basically, like, you... The cards in the... like, let's use Scum as an example. You have, like, face cards that have a value. And basically, like, you're trying to play runs or you're trying to play pairs or triples or whatever, right? And then, like, the higher your triples or your pairs or your runs go up, the better they are. And it's just pretty easy to, like, dictate what people have according to their play patterns. And because of that, like, I'm never not in the top 3 at the end of any given hand. And I don't know if that translated into, like, well, it's obvious that you wouldn't do these 3 things if you didn't have this, so, like, you obviously have this. And maybe it's because I play like more limited than most constructed players, so I think about more cards than other people do. I don't know. But the truth is like understanding your opponents is like basically the number one thing is you have to understand their skill level. Because like while Matt's saying like he's impressed by like the number of people that I like read, I don't even try to read people that are like significantly worse than me because it's not worth it.
Or better for that reason, right?
Oh, yeah,
because they
yeah.
might be leveling you, right?
Right. It's like it's not even worth trying. I actually remember a game against Ben Friedman where I was like, I can't read this dude. I was playing Green Black Snake. I don't even remember what he was playing. And then like I actually didn't read him twice, and I was like, I'm not even gonna try. I'm just gonna do this thing that's like the best play. And then like I ended up being like in a top deck war versus him, rather than like trying to figure out what he was doing. There was that GP Denver, I believe, a year ago this week.
He would have been playing, I think, Mardu Vehicles.
Yeah, oh, that's right. He was playing Mardu Vehicles. That is actually correct. But like I remember like thinking like this is a historically good matchup for me, but I think this player is about the same skill level as I am, and I don't actually know what he's trying to represent. And I've never watched this guy play. I don't quite understand what's going on. So while I think that Matt's evaluation of me is true, I think that there's a lot of factors that go into it as to when it's intuition versus when it's the thing that these two can do completely reasonably. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I
mean, everybody can read their opponents to some extent if you are just paying attention to what's happening in a game of Magic.
Michael, what did you have as your biggest strength for me?
I wrote that you're good at building game plans that are cohesive and that your decisions are based on reasoning, and staying consistent in that process and being willing to do sort of unconventional things gives you an edge. And what I would say, like to expand on this, I would say that I would say this sort of stretches into your deck building too, and a lot of the time people are good players, medium good players are good at practiced heuristics, and if you can exploit the fact that a lot of the players you're playing against are only operating on heuristics, you can get a big edge, and I think you're good at doing that.
I think that this is something that Matt and I talked about like a long time ago, in that I don't know if this is true about you anymore, Matt. So like correct me if I'm wrong, but like I don't lose to bad players, and Matt often would find himself losing to bad players. And it was because like I'm just not putting up with you being bad, and Matt was like giving his opponents like an inappropriate amount of credit. And the reason for this is like I know what you're going to do. Like you have maybe 13 different options any given turn. I'm going to narrow it down to 5, and I'm going to adjust my game plan accordingly. And then I'm going to do the same thing for my sideboard and my deck building according to the matchup, according to most players. And Matt, I didn't actually list this as a weakness of yours because I don't know that it is anymore because I haven't watched you play as much as I used to. But this used to be a weakness of yours.
Yeah, I certainly haven't found myself losing to players that are significantly worse to me as often. Like, no more so than
I think that you've probably
variance would
improved
dictate.
in this, right? Like, your results would just indicate that.
Yeah. Right.
But what do you think causes that strength for me and that old weakness of yours, even though it's not a weakness anymore?
Well, specifically, it sounded to me like you guys had a little bit of a disconnect in what you guys were talking about specifically.
So what
Interesting.
I would say is that my biggest takeaway here is that this sort of goes to reading people, right? But it's like, it's not what's the optimal play in a vacuum, it's what's the optimal play in this matchup against this player.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page.
That's true. Yeah.
Right? And
That's true.
Sort of where I'm trying to go with this. That like,
Right.
just understanding very firmly, this is what I'm trying to do here, even if it's maybe not always mana efficient, or, you know, I might be playing a worse deck, but I have an angle.
Yeah.
Right?
I
Like,
think
I know
it's-
what my deck is trying to do, and that has value.
I think that Michael and I are close to on the same page. What do you think the disconnect is?
Well, so it sounded to me like he was just talking about more of a general sense, and you were referring to specifically the way that you play against different players, like, and that's a valuable skill as well, being able to know sort of what level your opponent's on, right? Because you don't want to be
Sure.
2 levels above your opponent or the level behind. Either one is bad. But as far as your execution of that, like I do agree with Michael that you are very good at building a game plan. And yeah, I think that everything that you said was true. I think you're very good at beating players that are worse than you and understanding the ways that they're going to play. Any more advice that I would give on that particular subject, I feel would be less than helpful, though.
Well, I think that one of the things I would say for myself, we've actually talked about this on the podcast before, and I actually think this is a strength for all of us, but I think it's my biggest strength, and maybe it's because I don't value myself as a Magic player enough, that none of us listed this as our own strengths, because I think we're all very good at this, and that's sequencing my spells and lands correctly. This is something that I believe that you have basically no excuse for doing it incorrectly, because before Matt came on the podcast, Michael and I talked about this multiple times, that like the biggest edges you can get in Magic are mulliganing correctly and sequencing correctly, because like you have no excuse for doing them incorrectly. Like if you these are mistakes that if you make, like, that you deserve to lose that game, and I just don't believe that. It's funny because I text Matt today. I was like, I did these 7. I don't even know how many things I text you. I was like, I did all of these things wrong in this match, and I know that because I'm so good at this thing. Where it's like, I know how to play my spells in order, I know how to play my lands in order, and like I'm not going to make those mistakes because they're super easy to not make.
Interesting. I think that they're a little bit less cut and dry than you would imagine. Like I know that when Michael and I are on Skype, that's actually which lands to play on which turns is actually one of the biggest things that we just on the regular.
What I would say, though, is that if there's something you can disagree about, it doesn't fall into the egregious mistake category.
I agree. I think that,
like,
yes.
if we're debating about it and there are two sides, it's a decision,
right?
Not the game in a nutshell.
Exactly.
But there's definitely been times where I've just like played a land and then a turn later been like, oh boy, I don't know why I played that one, but that was like,
yes,
I should have just specifically not done, whatever I tried to do.
Right.
I don't know what I was thinking.
Okay,
but
so
that was just,
so not,
that was
not
just
sequencing
bad.
correctly. Not sequencing correctly through mostly not paying attention is what you're referring to.
No, I think that like
is the one that there's no excuse for.
I think that like if we look at like my last 100 matches of Magic, I would guess that I had like less than 10 blatantly obvious sequencing mistakes. I think that it is first nature for me to think about these things, and that is actually my biggest strength, is that I don't allow myself to lose to these things. But the thing is, kind of like Michael was talking about, is that when you do, it's so obvious, and like, it's like, man, like, I obviously lost this game because of this thing. Like, it was so blatantly obvious.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You generally get punished for sequencing mistakes more than anything else, right?
Well, I would say it's more obvious that you're punished for them. Like,
but I think it happens far before the punishment actually happens.
That's what I meant.
Sure. Yeah. It's just like they're the kind of mistakes where you like are like, oh,
it's like
I specifically could have done this differently.
Yeah, it's like
right?
during your opponent's draw step, right? You're like, your opponent draws, and you're like, oh my gosh, I just thought of 7 reasons why this was a bad play.
Right. It's like playing Tetris, where you put a piece somewhere, and then you're like, oh, well, that was a questionable decision.
Right.
Right. Just.
All right, so let's move on to Michael's strengths. So I'll go first. So I have witnessed this like probably 6 or 7 times, and I don't know if you've witnessed this, Matt, but like Michael has this innate ability to understand sideboarding due to knowing what the cards are that are important. And it's funny because Michael always seems to know what his opponents are like with the sideboard and his best configuration according to what they're going to do. And that's with every deck that he's playing. It doesn't actually matter if he's played like 3 games with a deck or 15 games with a deck. He just always seems to know, like, this is how my opponent's going to sideboard according to what they think I'm going to have, and then I'm going to do this. Is this something that you've noticed?
Yeah, I agree. I think Michael definitely does that better than most. We'll definitely be talking about sideboard plans from time to time. He'll be like, oh, my opponent's not going to have that in post board. And I think that, obviously, it's an oversimplification a little bit, right? Like, he and I are still working on sideboard plans throughout a tournament, as well as, everybody else is always working on sideboard plans. It's very much a flowing, continuous thing. But I do think that Michael's initial perceptions of what a sideboard plan should look like are better than most.
Yeah. And then what did you have for Michael's? Or Michael, do you want to respond to that before we move on?
I mean, I think that trying to build a lot of that comes down to trying to build 75s, and then some of that comes down to just trying to understand. I think getting away in testing from like winning and losing and trying to go by like what games feel like, what's happening in games that you win, what's happening in games that you lose. How do we build sideboards, and like what are we trying to do in a game when we're winning? I think that kind of it's if you can figure out why cards are supposed to be in your deck, your sideboard has a way better chance of being good.
I think that this has to do with a lot of Matt's opinions of your strength also, because I think both Matt's and mine opinions of your strengths have to do with like your understanding of cards. Matt, what did you have as Michael's biggest strength?
So I had that he's able to figure out his and his opponent's outs and play to them effectively. And I think that this is pretty apparent whenever we're talking about a specific line, and I'll be like, oh, this line only loses to this, this, and this. He's like, oh, but he also has this, 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 and this as outs as well. And like, the amount of outs that either we have or that our opponents have are compounded. And he's just really able to identify those very quickly and effortlessly.
Michael?
I like playing like kind of creature combat decks for this reason, and I think this is where it comes up the most. Because what you see this sometimes in counterspell decks with like, should I counter this, or like counterspell decks are like Lantern, right? It's like if I mill this or I counter this, what's the worst thing that they could follow it up with? But you see this in creature combat too, where it's like, how many things should I attack with? If this trades for this, is this good for me or bad for me, and why? And how does it change what I'm trying to draw and what they're trying to draw, and what could they have in their hand, or what do they have in their deck? And I think that, again, kind of like sideboarding, I think this is probably actually related to just being aware of what's in deck lists.
Michael, for you, I think that I'm very good at figuring out what makes sense in a format at a given time. You also have a caveat to that I'm not going to say, but like,
sure.
What do you think it is that... It's funny because like, one of the things that I was proudest of the CCMTG testing team, even before you came on, is just like, we knew the Pro Tour metagame going into the metagame, and I think that you amplified that, and I think that that's something that you're talking about here, is that going into a given weekend, you know the decks that are going to be played.
So I just mostly think that in general, positioning is more important than how good a deck actually is. And that playing the best position deck is almost always better than playing the slightly better deck. So I think of it like, there's like, you're like trying to jump onto to like a merry-go-round, right? And it's turning, and you're trying to find like the exact space you're going to jump in, and maybe you play blue-black mid-range this weekend, but it's not a declaration that you think blue-black mid-range is unequivocally great. It's a declaration that you thought blue-black mid-range was the deck for this weekend, or whatever it may be, right? And I think that a lot of people are scared to play new decks, or are scared to trust their gut on what makes sense to play. But I think that probably my biggest strength is probably just deck selection, and I think that a lot of that comes from just spending a lot of time like kind of consuming data. But I think that people don't trust themselves enough sometimes.
So I think it's more than that, though. I think that, so I do agree that a lot of these strengths that we've actually listed for you do come from just consuming massive amounts of deck lists, but I think that the amount of retention that you have in that, and the amount of ability to perceive where that's going is impressive.
The sideboard thing, right? Like, where you look at a sideboard and know like their ins and out. What feels like instantaneously to me and Matt, maybe it doesn't feel like that to you, but like the amount of work that Matt and I would have to put into like understanding how somebody's going to sideboard is significantly different than what you're doing.
Sure.
or at least it feels that way or appears that way.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe some of that is just that that's something that I have aptitude for.
Sure.
That stuff comes easier to me, just like reading stuff might
Right.
come easier to you.
Exactly.
Or, like, we all have things that we're better or worse at naturally, and I think that part of being the best you can be at Magic is trying to find your strengths and play to them.
I'd like to go over. We were going to go in reverse order for weaknesses, but due to the answers, I'd like to go over my obvious weakness first, according to my co-hosts. So Matt, why don't you go ahead and talk about it?
So what I put for your weakness was that you often get too high on a deck, and it makes it very hard for you to understand what the weaknesses of the deck are. I know a lot of times when we're testing for specific events, like it seems like the deck that you're playing is the greatest deck anybody's ever played.
That's it? That's all you have to say on that?
Yeah, I mean that's. I
kind of said a similar thing, which I think.
I'm just kidding. I think that's true about me too.
Which
I said to you in the. I'm sorry. I was just kidding.
I think you get excited about specific decks, not like. It doesn't necessarily matter which deck it actually is, but just getting really hyper-focused on one deck, I think, in general, it leaves you with less options, because if you're less willing to explore other choices, you end up... So what I think ends up happening is twofold. You end up with inflated percentages in testing, because you keep playing the same list over and over again, and instead of trying to, like, kind of wiggle into the metagame in the right, you're in the right place, you're refining the same list. But when you're playing against other people who are maybe trying to learn, your win percentage is going to be high if you find a good list and just...
Yeah.
Right, especially because your list will be very, very tuned.
Right.
Right.
This is actually something that people say to me very often. They're like, this list is extremely tuned. Like, how did you come to these numbers? And I can explain all of them. So I actually think that one of my biggest weaknesses is actually one of my biggest strengths. And we actually all agreed on this when we were chatting, is like, Spencer's biggest weakness is he focuses on a deck too much. But also, if that deck is good, Spencer's in a really good position. And I think that that's true. I think that right now, if you want to know about Green Black Snake, Blue Eye Control, or Green Red Dinos, which is a terrible deck, don't play it. But I could probably give you like a 75.
The best list.
Yeah, I could just tell you like this is the list you should be playing. It's not even close. However, I probably couldn't fit about a bunch of other decks. Before I move on to my weakness, I want to talk about something. It is not that I don't try other lists. I actually text Matt. I don't know if it was 9 decks that I've tried in the last 2 months, but like I actually, before every event, actually do try to play every single deck. It's tough. I'm a parent, so a lot of the time in the recent times, it's actually been better for me, I've found, to focus on a deck and try to be an expert on that deck than try and pick a spot in the metagame. Because I find my win percentage gets higher. However, over the last about 2 months, that actually isn't true. I almost exclusively play the deck that I think is the best deck and try and learn that rather than tune a deck. Now, I played...
So,
go ahead.
What do you think the correlation to that is to the fact that you've been playing more Magic lately as well? So I think it's much easier if you're on a limited amount of Magic a week. It's much better if you're just going to stick with one deck because you can actually learn it in that amount of time.
Yep. If I was playing, so before I was playing about 8 hours of Magic a week, and so like sticking to the deck that I knew and like trying to perfect that was much better. Even if it was switching decks and like trying 2 decks, but like right now I'm trying 5 decks, right? So it's like a huge difference. And now I'm playing 15 to 20 hours of Magic a week, which is significantly more. And that's almost, by the way, if you want to buy, like, a person to support Arena as a competitive Magic player, I will just tout it to the ends of the earth. You get at least 3 times as many games of Magic in on Arena as you can on MTGO, and it's better competition than you can in the friendly leagues. It's slightly worse than competitive leagues. Anyway, but I agree with these guys. I think that, like, for a significant portion of my Magic career, since my wife got pregnant, it's been the biggest weakness. And if you, like, look at earlier results of mine, you know, like, I was playing a different deck every single week. It was like, one week I was on Esper Spirits, one week I was on Temur, Wolf Run, Green Red Wolf Run, Bant Pod, Temur Pod, Blue White Delver. Like, I played everything because I played like 60 hours of Magic a week. So it really just is, right now, it is the biggest weakness of mine. But and once we get into Michael's weaknesses, we'll actually talk about why that's a strength of mine as well. But my biggest weakness for myself is a little bit different. Because I actually think I have a very, very inherent flaw in my Magic game that I've talked to Quentin about that I plan on fixing in the next 3 months. I just literally don't understand how to win with small creatures. So, I'm specifically actually talking about white and red slanted aggressive decks. I don't actually grasp how to utilize small creatures and what their value is in a given matchup. So the reason for this is, this is just my opinion, so tell me if I'm wrong, but, like, small creatures' values change, like, drastically throughout a game. Like, whether you're ahead, whether you're behind, whether you're blocking, whether you're attacking, like, small creatures just have inherently different values turn by turn throughout a game, and I have a really hard time keeping up. I legitimately don't get it.
I would say that the value of small creatures changes based on your opponent's life total in general, and I don't think it's always that the value of those creatures goes up. Actually, I think that the value of those creatures often goes down as your opponent's life total goes down.
But when I try
and you're
to
more willing to trade them off for damage.
So I agree with that, but the problem is that when I try to play the way that you just suggested, I lose.
What I would say is that it's complex, and one of the things that becomes important in games like this is that you're sort of, it's like you're playing limited, but you know your opponent's deck list.
Okay. Tell me more.
Okay, so we're not trying to, like, usually win on, like, big picture macro stuff. We're trying to win on, or at least not as much as normal, right? So we're not going to win with, like, broad game plans. We're going to win by playing the minutia perfectly and then making the best available play over and over again, right? And that has to do with, like, how you want to use your Bomat couriers.
But the problem is
how you value creatures against Chain Whirler,
Sure.
when you play things out, when you hold them.
The problem is that I don't understand, like, how to value my cards turn by turn throughout a game. Like, I actually don't know how this Phoenix is best used, how this Chandra is best used, what turn I'm supposed to play this Hazoret versus the other 2 spells in my hand. Like, I actually don't get it.
So my thought there is that you probably, if you're losing playing it the way that I just suggested, then it's probably because you're either farther or closer to the finish line than you think you are when you start playing that way. Either your opponent is at a high enough life total that they're able to grind you out of cards, or they're at a low enough life total that you should have been doing that already. And it's very hard to figure out. Like, it's definitely the hardest part about aggro decks is knowing when you're supposed to start throwing away cards for damage.
I actually think the Bomat Courier is one of the hardest Magic cards I've ever played with. Like,
or against. I think it's actually a lot harder to play against than with.
I'm not alone. Like, I actually don't know what to do.
Well, I frequently, like, Karizev Bomat Courier Settle the Wreckage is, like, the most interesting 3-card combo that exists right now in Magic.
I agree with that.
Is there ever a reason to stack it to where the monkey or the Bomat Courier doesn't get the card before the monkey?
All right.
Sure, whether you're supposed to settle before or after the monkey. Right.
So my goal in Magic right now is actually to fix this. I have a bunch of aggro decks loaded right now. I'm gonna just jam these things till the end of the day. Go ahead, Michael.
No, I think that, like, a lot of it is just experience, and that, like, it's not necessarily that there are, like, big picture things you can say. As, like, I don't think there's a mantra that someone can give you that's going to like fix your
No.
ability to play aggro decks, right?
No.
It's just like you literally. Why does Wesco win so much more with white aggressive decks than anyone else, and why does he win so much more with white aggressive decks than with anything else, right? Because he's just like played these decks to the point that he just intuitively is going to understand all of those things better than his opponent, and you know, he's just good at that.
You know, here's the thing: is that I'm just trying to be honest with myself, because if I look back, and I don't know what's true before, like X number of years back, I don't know what's true. I know that I played like Hell's Thunder decks back in the day and stuff like that. I don't know the total number of competitive REL tournaments that I played in, but what I do know is that since like Boss Sly, since like Mono Red Heroic, I've played Mono Red, I believe 3 times in competitive REL, and am 0-10 with the decks that I've played.
So, tying this back into what Matt and I were saying, I think that like some weakness, being weak or especially weak with certain styles of decks, like to the point that you feel that they're just not an option, right? If you're looking at like mono red and
Right.
you're like, I'm not going to be able to win with this deck,
Right.
it really limits what you can do, and it forces you to stick with decks that may not be better positioned.
Yes.
Because you'll look at another deck and say, man, this deck looks really good on paper, but I never win when I play this kind of thing. And it's a completely unreasonable position to find yourself in, given that you're actually playing a fair amount of Magic.
No, and the thing is that if we just look at like, so I'm not sure where we left off before the editing, but I want to talk about kind of why I think that my biggest weakness is something that both these guys share, and that's that I do think that when you are limited to the amount of Magic that you can play, that I was playing for the last couple years, I think that it's almost impossible to try and be well-rounded across, like, I mean, you can be well-rounded across, like, 3 different macros, but, like, as far as being well-rounded across, like, micro-archetypes, I actually think it's impossible for the amount of Magic that I was playing. And I think that these guys are, like, 100% right on, like, what my biggest weakness was at that point. And, I mean, to both of your credits, like, I've only been playing as much as I've been playing for since the last RPTQ, which I took, you know, top four at, or top whatever at, right? And I'm excited to keep that going. Like, you know, day 2 GPs, took, you know, missed 1 match behind a Pro Tour at, because I think that the thing that you guys have listed as my biggest weakness, I hope that I can turn into a pretty big strength. But that being said, I think that even the weakness that I mentioned for myself kind of feeds into the weakness that you guys mentioned for me.
Yeah, definitely. I think just lack of range in general is a really difficult weakness to deal with, because it pigeonholes you into playing decks that you don't actually believe are good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's not even that I don't believe are good. I know Black-Red is the best deck. I actually don't even think it's, like, close. I actually have never won a Black-Red mirror. I don't know if it was Matt or Quentin I was texting about this today, but I have 3-2'd, I believe, every single league I've ever played with Black-Red.
Sure. I mean, it is kind of a 60% kind of deck.
Sure, but, like, am I better than that? I don't know. Matt, who do we want to move on to? Should we move on to Michael, since you believe your biggest weakness is my biggest weakness is strength?
Sure, it kind of ties in.
Sure. Let's move on to Michael really quick. So, by the way, I hope this podcast, I hope people appreciate the fact that, like, we love each other and, like, we're willing to do this to each other. By the way, in Michael's biggest strike, he talked about how he's a bad Magic player, so I want you guys to know how humble this dude is.
I mean, like, everything is relative, right?
All to a fault, really.
But I do think that, so for me, I put Michael's biggest weakness is uh, he can't accept a deck's weakness. Or sorry, is this what I put? Oh yeah, okay. Actually, I understand what I put. So Michael has a problem where he can't accept that decks have weaknesses. So because of that, and you guys play way more Magic with each other than I do, but Michael just is turned off of a deck super fast. And I have been like, Michael, you played like 10 games with this deck. Like, you need to give it more time. Um, and this is something that I've witnessed that I could be completely wrong about, but it seems like, Michael, you have a problem with, like, accepting the fact that no deck is going to be perfect in a meta game, and that you just cycle so quickly.
Yeah, I would say that can happen if you're like if I just end up playing a list that doesn't either is like not tuned well for what I end up playing against, or just doesn't like line up the way that I want it to. I can get kind of turned off of archetypes,
Sure.
which when
Yeah.
when you're trying to like keep yourself open can be a bad thing.
Matt?
I would agree with that, and I think I can list a couple of examples even in the semi-recent past. Like the Hollow One decks when they first came out were very untuned, and I remember us talking about whether the deck was good, and you were just convinced that it was atrocious for a long time. And admittedly, those particular lists were very bad.
Sure.
But like I think if we had looked at it through a different lens, we might have been able to figure out that like what the decks were doing well at very least. And then there was another scenario with you and I had talked about playing some version of Flame of Keld prior to Pro Tour Dominaria, and I was specifically thinking something very similar to what the Wizards decks are doing now, and I returned off of it so quickly that you and I never even got to play a league together. Like, you were already off of it before I even got on.
Can I actually add to that? I actually think that
Sure.
it might have been 2 Pro Tours ago, Michael, where we were pretty convinced that the best decks were Teferi decks and Black Red, and you were convinced that both Teferi decks and Black Red decks were bad because of their respective weaknesses. Is this something that you notice about yourself, or is this something that...
Yeah, I definitely do. What I would say is that I was right about one of those. The Teferi decks were bad, and I didn't think the bad, but I didn't like anything I could come up with
Sure.
for mirror matches specifically.
I think...
So, my issue, like, in that spot wasn't necessarily about it wasn't about the decks as much as the event. And my experience playing Pro Tours has been that if you just show up with the 30% of the field deck with no innovation and you are not a masterful limited player, you're just going to get crushed.
So I actually think that if you were to take like players and their skill sets and like put them on opposite sides, and one of the reasons that I believe that Michael has been so good for this podcast is that Michael and I are good at very different things. And that's good for me. It's actually grown me a ton of Magic player. I hope it's helped you, Michael. But I think that my skill of reading players and my skill of like understanding a macro archetype or even a micro archetype is something that, Michael, you've actually listed as... I believe that your biggest strength, your biggest weakness for yourself was my biggest weakness in reverse, right?
No, it was your biggest strength in reverse. What I would say
Sure.
is that I think I have similar ideas a lot of the time, but I'm not necessarily good at executing that in like high level events.
Can you break that down? Like because I actually agree. I actually think that you and I are like divergent, and it reminds me of a time that I was talking to PVDDR, and we were talking about Shahar, and he's like, Shahar is great at Magic, but Shahar and I don't see Magic in the same way, and it kind of reminds me of you and me in that the things that you're good at, I'm bad at, and the things that I'm good at, I don't know that you're great at. I mean, you're just great at everything, in my opinion. But, but like, I do think that whether it's breaking down like what an opponent's doing or breaking down a plan, sometimes I think that you get focused, where I also get focused, but it's like it's about different things. I don't know what I'm trying to say here.
I think, like, I was talking to Matt about this because I lost a game in I lost a game playing a mirror match this weekend where, like, if we'd both played face up, I would have won 100% of the time, I think. I actually don't think there's any way I could have lost if we both played face up.
I think your hand was much better than his if you guys were playing with perfect information.
It lined up well against what he had if we were playing with perfect information.
Sure.
Right.
I don't know that my hand was better in a vacuum, but it was very good against his hand in some ways. And because of the cards he didn't have more than the cards that he did, I like got kind of far down the rabbit hole on trying to hold removal spells and just like got a little bit too low. Like my life total got a little bit too, but like the specifics aren't really the point. The idea is more that like I was trying to do something with my cards that at some point in the game I should have been able to figure out, hey, I need to do this differently. And I didn't make that decision. And by sort of continuing to double down on that, it just like it worked out very poorly, and I lost a game that I would have won if I had basically played it in any other way.
I think that I think that this is a symptom of something that we're all probably going to fall victim to in the next couple months, which is the amount of Magic that we play and trying to force ourselves into situations that we believe our decks are supposed to be in. It's funny that you guys think that's a strength for me and a weakness for Michael, to be honest, because I don't see it that way.
It's kind of a sliding scale, right? Like it's a skill to not just play like the heuristically. You can sort of like,
but
fight your.
But I don't
heuristic.
I don't think it's hard to switch, right? Maybe that's what my strength is that I can see like, okay, maybe I'm actually understanding what you're saying now. Now that you keep going.
All I would say is that you have to sort of understand when your heuristics are good and when they're bad. And although it's often like your heuristics are just a tool, you need to know when to sort of go against them. You probably also need to know when just like making the most simple, like on heuristic play is correct, right? Like this is, he played a creature, I kill it. He does like just the most simple basic response, not, well, if he has this and this, then maybe it would be better if I do this instead. And the cost, it's like, what is the cost to all the plays, and why am I actually taking the line that I'm taking, right? Like you sort of start thinking, I guess I would say that it seems like sometimes I start thinking plays are bad because they're like a given.
They're too obvious.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Like that you're going to get rewarded.
Yeah, I get that.
Outplaying your opponent more than you'll get rewarded for just beating them with the cards in your hand, when really it's win.
It's interesting because I've actually found myself questioning that a lot for some of the first time this weekend, where I'm like, is this actually the right play or just the obvious play? Like I kept thinking that the play was specifically wrong because it was obvious. I actually have this is what I would normally do. It's probably
right, where suddenly
not
every play your opponent makes is bait, and that's just not how Magic works.
The thing
right,
is,
exactly,
I actually have this exact same problem in sideboarding decisions. I'm like, this is obviously how I would sideboard, but like, are they going to next level me and do this?
Sure, and then you end up just siding into a pile of nonsense.
Yeah, exactly. That's literally exactly what happened, and it's like, why did I just next level myself? Like, this is so stupid.
They didn't even need to level you?
Yeah. They were just like, oh, we're just playing Magic, man. And I'm like, I'm so mad. Yeah.
Kind of the same idea, right?
When Matt was talking, it was like, oh, I did this to myself before a match even started.
Yeah, it's hard to avoid every once in a while. I mean, but I think that just like, you know,
Can I just
like
say something before we move on to
yeah, yeah.
Matt's point about you, which is how much he hates you and how terrible you are? No, not really. But I just want to say that so far in this episode, like, we've been really willing to admit our faults, and I'm kind of proud. So I just want to say thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just like realistically talking about how good you are isn't really like a great or interesting tool for getting better.
Yeah.
And Magic has enough variance that like you really need to find the places where it wasn't variance and work on improving them if you want to get better.
Speaking of which, Matt's criticism of you, Michael, is criticism that I think he'd give to like a 99.8% of Magic players, which is that. Well, do you want to talk about it, Matt?
Well, so I don't think I would give this to most Magic players. I do think that I think that a lot of players play in situations where they can't possibly win, and I think it's mentally
All right,
taxing and not good for you.
Pause. Pause. 99.8% of good Magic players have this problem.
Sure, that's probably true. I mean, there is a trend when you play more games of Magic, you see how unlikely it is for these games to work out. So here's my weakness for Michael. I said that he doesn't force himself to play from behind in testing and loses experience that would help him when he falls behind in a game that matters. And the reason I say that is because when we play on Magic Online, oftentimes he'll have hit the, right click concede button before I can even understand what's happened. Like
you guys
am a chronic snap conceder.
Here's the actual problem with it though. Like, oftentimes the actual best and most interesting Magic that you can play is when you are handicapped in some way, right? Like if you're stuck on 3 lands against an opponent that's fully functional, those are the times when you have to play tighter than any, right?
Sure.
And oftentimes it's not going to work out for you because it's very hard to play with these handicaps, especially if your opponent is, reasonable at Magic. Like, for instance, I played against Yuya in the red-black mirror, and I got stuck on 3 lands in game 3. But I think I was actually playing very good Magic, and I think that in a lot of scenarios I could have won that game even with missing my 4th land drop 3 or 4 times.
Sure.
And I think that when you don't give yourself enough opportunities to play from those games from behind, first of all, you mentally end up checking out, right? Like, you're like, oh man, I'm behind, so like I'm just going to kind of go through the motions but not really imagine ways that I could win this game. And the second thing is just not putting yourself in those scenarios doesn't test your skills enough.
Michael, can I respond to this first?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I also do this pretty badly. And
Just like snap concede.
So this is pretty common, something that I'll do on Magic Online and on MTG Arena is like there's like a 7% chance, or it's probably not that low. It's probably way higher than that, right? It's probably like 20 to like 30% for me to win the game. But like, do I need to like win those games? Like, I'm gonna play the game no matter what when I'm playing in paper. Like, do I need to do that in testing? But here's the actual problem, and this is something that it's like probably one of PV's best articles is an article he did on Brad Nelson when he talked about like Brad Nelson's unwillingness to like play from behind in playtesting. And it's something that I've thought about a lot in my Magic career. In fact, I've thought about it literally as I've hit the concede button. I'm like, I'm so dumb! Hit concede. And I don't think that Matt's wrong. I think, Michael, that we both probably have this weakness. And, like, we see the writing on the wall, and, like, we're very unlikely to win the game, and we're just not willing to spend the time to lose.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not, like, snap conceding in paper. Although, I know this is a problem for me online, because once I accidentally conceded a game, like, I was, like, trying to F6 when I accidentally pressed concede OK instead. So I just went,
so
like,
for what it's worth, I think the way you do it is much better.
Yeah,
it's much better for grinding value on Magic Online.
Right. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is just see how the games feel, and I'm not very concerned with the actual results. So the point is, like, if the game is mostly over, I'm kind of on to the next one. But I know this is something I do too much. Specifically, the time that I just accidentally conceded instead of passing the turn was sort of a wake-up call. I've never heard of anyone else doing that before, so it's
I've done it. I've definitely done it.
Just I went to pass the turn and accidentally ended up losing the game. It was really powerful.
I actually think, to be fair, for a former co-host on the podcast, I actually think this is Casey Bloodworth's biggest weakness too. Like, the number of games where, like, Casey was probably, like, 40% to win that he conceded against me in playtesting, I was like, what is happening right now? Like, I do think that, like, good players, like, know when they're likely to be beat, and they just will snap concede in playtesting pretty often. And as Paulo and both Todd Anderson have said about Brad, I do think that it's a weakness of, like, some legitimately great players.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's interesting to compare playtesting to actual tournaments, because what I would say is in tournaments, most people play too long.
Yeah.
Most people do not value the clock enough and should be conceding much faster than they are. Like, Matt won a game this weekend that went, 35 minutes where he thought he was dead on turn 4, and that can happen every once in a while, but
oh, trust me, the whole game I was thinking, should I be conceding this game? Like, the problem was I had Planeswalkers in play the whole time, and I'm like, I can't win this game. No way.
Right. So I mean, but the point really is that I think most people will, like, people do this against, like, Lantern all the time, right? People complain about how slow Lantern is. Lantern's like a fast combo deck. You're usually dead on turn 4. You're just unwilling to concede.
Can we rewind for a second? Matt, are you not the one that won a match in the top 4 of PPTQ again? In the, like, was it the Green Luck Mirror, where, like, your opponent, like, you were 0% to win the game, but your opponent just, like, literally was like, yeah, you could win.
Maybe, I don't know. I don't remember what the specific.
I don't want to throw the player under the bus.
Are you talking about?
I don't want to. But
are you talking about the game where I attacked with a bunch of creatures and then they blocked a Grim Flayer in such a way where I was able to win with the Grasp of Darkness?
That's the one.
Yeah, that was just
that wasn't in the top 8. That was just a regular Swiss round. But yes, that did happen.
But the difference was that was a game 3, so you wouldn't have conceded.
But no, hold on.
It depends on who you're playing against too, right? Like, if I'm playing a game 1 against Paulo and he's way ahead and has some kind of an engine set up, like, time in the round is way more valuable than the time that I could, win 0.0001% of the time if he whiffs 4 times on Search for Iskana. Right? Like,
right.
That's not to say that it's impossible to win that game, because that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that your overall equity is higher if you concede. And I would say that one of my bigger problems when I play on Magic Online is that too often I care about that. Like, I will play specifically for equity in spots where it, like Matt says, it's probably better. Like, it's probably better to be more interested in learning from those games.
Yeah, here's the thing: it's better to just concede the games when you're looking for what a matchup looks like, or, like, if you're trying to get an idea of how to play to a winning position. But if you're trying to play a deck because this is the deck you're going to play and you're trying to get actual reps with it, then I think it's better to play those games from behind.
Right, and the question really is what your breaking point for behind is, and I definitely think my threshold sometimes creeps a little too high.
Yeah, I'd like to move on from Michael's weaknesses because they're so far and few between. But I do want to say, Michael, I just want to read what you put here because I tried to explain it and I did a really bad job. But you said the same thing I would say are Spencer's strength can often be my weaknesses. Trying too hard to play a game that isn't really happening. What do you mean a game that isn't really happening? Like, what is your weakness there?
So what I think is it's getting too excited about what I'm trying to do rather than playing the cards that I'm playing and rather than playing to the cards that I'm playing and my opponents are playing. So I think this can sometimes happen when you have, like, this can happen when your deck is cool sometimes. Like, if you're playing, like, Gate to the Afterlife, sometimes you find yourself, like, wanting to mill yourself with Minister of Inquiries when your opponent's at 10 and, your 1-2 should really be getting in there. That would be, like, kind of an example I could give you. But just, I think in general, trying to understand what is actually happening in the game in front of you and just playing that game regardless of what, your side plan would dictate, right? Sometimes you might side into blue-white historic, you just don't draw any creatures, and you realize, well, this game I'm going to have to play blue-white control, or I can't defend this History of Benalia because I need to be able to counter something else, even though History of Benalia is good in this matchup or whatever, right? Like, it's just knowing when to move away from what you thought was going to happen or what you tried to, like, prepare for into these are the cards that are in play. These are the cards that this is the game that is being played.
Right. So yeah, just to add on to that, I would say that Michael's one of the best, ever at guiding a game to where he wants it to be and having an idea of what he wants the game to look like before a matchup starts. But if the game plays out in a way that doesn't favor that particular game plan, then he has a hard time changing.
Okay.
Like if he decides that he's playing a match where card advantage is going to be the determining factor, but it actually ends up in a damage race, it's hard to switch.
This actually makes a lot of sense to me because, like, I feel like I'm really good at making a game plan, changing my game plan to be about something rather than about the thing that I thought it would be about. So I actually do understand what Michael was saying now, where I didn't actually when he wrote it down.
Yeah. And it's something that, you try to work on and you try to get better at. Like, I played a game this weekend that was I was really proud of how I played it. It was probably one of the best games I've ever played. And I won it by playing against Storm, casting a Doomfall that I'd had in my hand since turn 2 to exile my opponent's Ornithopter and attack him for lethal.
Yes. I think that one of the things that people don't realize is, like, this is actually something that I find really hard about streaming, is that you'll be thinking, like, very far ahead or about different things than the people, and they might convince you about something different than what you're thinking about, and you're like, yeah, I guess that's true.
It's easy to end up in the halfway between line.
Exactly. And I think that the truth is, like, you need to decide what things are about. I'd like to, just due to time, because, like, we're way over on this podcast, but I think it's been really good.
Yeah, it's like a 3-hour podcast.
Yeah, it's, I've improved I don't even. I do care. I do care about listeners, but I don't care about the listeners at this point because I've gotten so much better at Magic by just talking about this, or at least I hope I have. Maybe practice comes out and like I'm just still real bad. But
I feel that way every time I play Magic. I'm like really.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm sure that's gonna be still true, but like that's just true for all of us.
Better in this game. Yeah,
sure.
Oh man, I have that thought a lot.
I'd like to talk. I'd like to end this with Matt. Because he's the only one here with a GP top 8. Which is funny considering Michael and Mai's criticism of Matt.
I don't actually think this.
No.
I don't think
this
actually
appropriate criticism.
I think this is specifically in line with.
Yeah,
specifically in line with that.
I think it lines up with like how Matt's events have gone, and I think both Spencer and I basically said that Matt's biggest weakness is like when things start to go wrong.
You're right.
He loses focus, and the wheels kind of fall off a lot of the time. Where I've seen Matt go from like X2 or X3 and just go like lose a bunch of times. Where especially as soon as he's past X2, it's just like.
Yeah,
isn't there, and
it's a lot of
I'm basically
like,
you're X5 almost 100% of the time.
You're a better player than this, but when you get to 8-2, 9-2, and then you lose 9-3 is a very good record. Like maybe you're not live for top 8, but that's you should be able to cash.
It's tough. How many X4s? How many X4s do you have lifetime? Like how many 2-point finishes do you have, Matt?
I have one 2-point finish. It wasn't an X4 though. It was an X3-1, and it was my very first GP. It might have actually been my first day 2.
So I think that there's so first of all, I want to just be clear to our listeners that the three of us, because of where we want to go in Magic, value GP so much more than SCGs, more than PTQs, more than like. GPs are the way to become silver. They're the way to become bronze. They're the way to become gold. Like, that's just how you get on the Pro Tour. Like, that's just the path to that. And I don't know this for a fact, but I would say before this weekend, Michael Hinderocker had the longest running day 2 streak in Magic. And the opposite of that is that Michael has never top 8 at a Grand Prix for some reason. But other players in our playgroup have. And while I do think that Matt's biggest weakness is like, I don't give a flying flabbergast unless I'm in contention to make $1,000. I also think it's a strength for him, and I think this one's tough because I think that keeping your focus and keeping your want and keeping your fire and your zone and whatever you're gonna call it, I don't think that's easy for anyone. But Matt, why is it especially difficult for you?
Well, so the actual problems here is that it's my entire lifestyle mentality. It's not just my Magic game. Like I am very much like that about everything. If it's not going to be the best, I just don't want it at all. And it is a problem for me in a lot of aspects of my life. But the biggest problem with actually attacking this weakness in Magic is that I'm not actually convinced that it's a problem for me. I agree that it's leading. I agree. We're not in disagreement that it's going to lead to a lot less X3s and X4s in my life. I'm not. That's the problem.
You would
sure
already
that
be silver. Like that would be a fact of your life, literally today.
But is that what I want?
What is it? Do you want to go back to the Pro Tour?
I mean, the secret is that you can't get.
You
better.
can't get gold if you don't get silver.
You just need more shots. Yeah, everyone needs more shots.
I get what you're saying. I get it. Because you know what? I hate, like in my career, right? Like, I am the fastest to release a product with profitability. That's not even true. It didn't release profitability. But to make money, to, like, do this thing, and, like, I don't want to be second best. I get that. But, like, at the same time, you have to take the wins that you get. And, like, it's funny that, like, we're stating your biggest weakness, and you're, like, saying, but is it a weakness? But it's like, yeah. Yeah.
No, here's what I'm saying. I know that this happens. I agree. I agree that I play much worse Magic when I'm out of contention. Mm-hmm. I agree that I start playing badly and I'm losing matches because of it. So I agree that it's a weakness in that sense. What I'm saying is I don't know that it's a problem.
I think that had you been silver already, and you would lock up multiple Pro Tour invites, that you wouldn't feel this way. And I don't know. I've already dictated how jealous I am. Like, I played in my 12th Grand Prix just recently. Ever. So, like, I'm at a different place in Magic than you guys. But, Matt, do you remember the text conversation that we had where I said, like, I was playing for this Pro Point, and I wanted to make this match matter? Like, this match of Magic that was for a single Pro Point I wanted to matter to me, that didn't matter to me at GP Vegas, and I knew was a problem for me because it didn't matter. And I wanted to change that. And, like, the thing is like, how many matches do you realistically get that are playing for Pro Points? It's probably less than, like, it's way less than 20% of matches that you play.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that the secret really is that Pro Points have some monetary value, and, like, I would way rather 5-0 than 4-1. But I would way rather 4-1 than 3-2.
Sure.
And if top 8ing is a 5-0, then I'm still kind of into the 4-1.
It's interesting. So my Magic Online results mimic that a lot too. Like I actually get a lot more 5-0s than 4-1s. Probably not, but it's disproportionate at least.
It's funny because I get mostly 3-2s, and that tells me that, like, maybe I value the value too much. I don't know, but I will say this: I think that of my friends that play Magic, when Matt says something, I probably trust it the most. But the problem is that I don't trust Matt's results the most. So this is something difficult for me as, like, one of your best friends. Is like, how do I value your results differently than what you're saying? Because, like, they actually don't mesh.
In what respects?
I just think that you give up too easily. Even if it's like, so for example, if you love a deck, I actually think you'll 5-0 with it multiple times. Because you're in love with it and you're super invested. And when you're invested in Magic, you play significantly better than other players that I know. The problem is that you get uninvested so quickly that I don't know when to trust you. This is just the most honest I could possibly be on a podcast. What are your thoughts on what I just said? You can just be honest with me, because I'm probably just wrong.
No, I mean I'm sure that I do play. I know that I play better when I'm more invested, but I think that's.
It's true of people, but
I think that's true of everybody.
Yeah. Do you think that you get uninvested quickly?
Yeah, that's possible as well. I mean, obviously, like we were talking about, I definitely get uninvested in Grand Prix quickly. Like if I.
Sure.
Yeah, if I start doing poorly in a Grand Prix, it's basically lights out. And I mean it. I don't know. Maybe at some point I will, be filled with regret about my decisions. But I don't know. It's really hard to work on something that you don't know is an issue, right?
You got a pro point this weekend, right?
I did.
Yeah.
But so here's the difference there, though, is I was not actually playing for the pro point. I was playing because that deck was really fun. I was just having a great time the whole time.
Sure, I'm glad to hear that, because you finished day 1 7-1. I was like, to me it was like, if Matt's invested, I can see him top 8ing, and then I saw your first loss. I was like, well, I think Matt's gonna X5. Matt,
I mean, it's also fair that you're just a lot more likely to go 3 and 4 on day 2 or 4 and 3 on day 2 than you are to go 6 and 0, right?
No, that's true.
Part of it is just statistically, we're just looking at the bell curve here, right? Most people are going to go about this.
Yeah, I mean the players are much better on day 2.
I think that's not only just true; it's just unequivocally true. But I will say what I said before on Matt's weaknesses, that if there's a player that is going to say something to me that I'm like, okay, this person says this because they believe it because of X, Y, and Z, it is going to be Matt. Matt, the weakness that you have for yourself is very different than what Michael and I had for you. And you have your biggest weakness as, playing around the most likely scenario.
Right.
Talk about it.
All right, so basically, I can give you an example. So I'm playing a game in the Mirror this weekend, and my opponent, I have a Rekindling Phoenix in play, and my opponent just plays a Chain Whirler just right out from his hand, right? And I was thinking to myself, I would never do that unless I had a second Chain Whirler. That's the only scenario, because I have a Rekindling Phoenix in play, right? It makes so much more sense for him to draw any of his 30 removal spells in his deck, kill the Rekindling Phoenix, and then Chain Whirler the Elemental, right? Mm-hmm. So I immediately put him on Goblin Chain Whirler in hand, which is the most likely scenario, I feel, given the information that I had. Now, I made a play at some point in that game where I attacked with a Rekindling Phoenix, leaving my Liliana to be attacked by a Chain Whirler and nothing else, right? This is fine because I didn't want to block with the Rekindling Phoenix anyway, because I was so sure that he had Chain Whirler in hand. But as he was going into his 5th turn, I realized how insanely bad it was against Glorybringer, which is the worst case scenario. Even though the Glorybringer is a 2-of, and it's much less likely for him to have the Glorybringer there, it is the worst case scenario, and I almost definitely could have won the game without that 4 damage by just playing around it.
You
understand what I'm saying? I made the best play for the most likely scenario, but not the best play for the worst case scenario, which is, if you can afford to play around the worst case scenario, I feel that you should.
So, to be fair,
if it still leads to a win,
I've seen Spencer do this once or twice too, where I've seen both you guys. I mean, I think everyone does this every once in a while, but I can think of times where what happens is, if you start assuming that they have cards based on how they play, sometimes you're just trying to read randomness, and they actually just played the Chain Whirler because they had a bunch of 4 and 5 drops, or they just played something because it was the only thing they could do. And you do it in a way that then punishes you really hard because it wasn't a signal, right? It's like you thought, oh man, this card was a really good draft pick, and then it just ended up that, no, they just had to take a better card for their deck instead, whatever.
Sure, that's definitely true, and that could be the case in this particular scenario. But that was just a very specific example for a broader topic.
Yeah,
I actually I am glad that Michael brought me up, because this is something that I noticed in recording myself with Mason as well as streaming. It's like when I say plays out loud, I'm like, oh, well, what about this, this, and this? And I think about more things. And the last limited Grand Prix that I played in, I think I only got 1 pro point at it, but what did I actually don't remember what I got that Grand Prix. Anyway, I was constantly blocking out loud and attacking out loud, which is something that I hadn't done before. And one of the things that I realized is that if you give your opponent enough credit, you can just literally say, outside of a few select players, but it's okay, if I give you this information, it's whatever. You either have the card or you don't. But if I play like you have it, I actually have the information and the advantage, which is you could have one of these 3 cards. If you do, it's bad for me. Here's how you played this game. Here's 3 different block scenarios. Here's 3 different attack scenarios. Here's this, this, and this. And I actually find that this is something that I actually used to also be bad at, that I actually think I fixed by just being willing to think longer, because I play so quickly. And I don't know if that's something you thought about, because
No, it's true. It's true. If you run through all the scenarios, it's very easy to come up with the worst case scenario and play around it, right? Because you're like, oh, I'm just gonna lose the game right now if this happens. So that's certainly some of it.
And I actually think that, Matt, you actually play fast enough to do this too, and it's something that I've started to do with different decks. So I actually 0-3'd the PTQ this weekend online, but I actually think it was some of the best Magic I've ever played. And literally every single game I lost, I drew 12 or more lands with mono red, and I actually think that going through these scenarios out loud, especially when you play as much Moto as you do, actually will help you fix this problem pretty easily.
I was gonna say,
well, I do actually play specifically. I play specifically better on Magic Online than I do in paper for a lot of those reasons. I don't feel any rush at all when I'm playing on Magic Online, because the clock is all my own.
Right.
I can do with it what I want, whereas I feel like I'm sharing the clock with somebody when I'm playing in paper, so I feel like I don't want to use more than my fair share.
I would say that some of this too comes down to sort of things that you're also good at, and I think that that's sort of a common theme, that sort of everything has to have balance. And I would say that being good at the minutia of the game, and being able to say, I wouldn't do this unless this and this and this. Sometimes it's not about necessarily making the most optimal play given the information that you think you have, but the least disastrous play, right?
Right. That's exactly what my point was.
You're not going to win this game with a Rekindling Phoenix. And it's mostly about
most of the time that
you're never racing, right? One person's supposed to attack, the other person's wrong.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. Most of the time that 4 damage is unmissed. There's that one game, right, where you're like, oh man, I can't believe he attacked with that Rekindling Phoenix on turn 4 and it won him the game.
Right.
So there's not no value in making that attack. But it is a disaster when I'm wrong.
I think it's getting too excited about the minutia rather than understanding that when you win this matchup, it's going to be mostly because your opponent ends up with no permanence in play.
Sure.
Right? I mean, most of the red-black mirrors, one person ends up with everything dead, and the other person ends up with 2 Glorybringers.
No, it's definitely true. It's almost always ended in a landslide, where one person just has the riches.
Right, and I think that trying to take some focus away from the minutia of a specific play, I can't block with this, so it has to attack, compared to I can't block. I might not be able to block with this, but I don't need to block with this.
Right.
Right. Because
no, it's true. The threat of block was worth a lot, honestly. Bread of Block was worth a lot. Yeah, I agree.
or at least more than nothing.
I think that
Right.
this might be the longest podcast we've ever done. So I'm good.
Yeah, by like a lot.
But don't forget, you can check us out at patreon.com/ccmdg. You can find me at Spencer H. You can find Michael at MetroMGG. You can find Matt Kling at The Witch Kling. You can find the podcast at ccmdg. You can join the Facebook group at the Constructed Criticism Family. If you're a patron of $5 or more, you can join the Constructed Critics group. You can join the clan by messaging me at Spencer13H or Quentin at Earthstripe or Spencer13Dev. Or Quentin at Earthstripe. It's URTHSTYRPE. I don't know the point of this other than to just easily find your friends. But
There isn't really a point of it. It's just cool.
But
Get some pickup games.
just like the Discord, this is the last week we'll be doing hashtag Would That Be Good. I believe that this is a lot of people's favorite.
You really
segment.
want to do it this week?
No, this is it. This is the end.
It feels like this is the week to just
Yeah, I
call
think
it
we
since
should
we're
do
like
2
3.5
weeks.
hours
I
into
think we
this
should do
podcast.
2 weeks next week and then call it. So if you want to get your tweet, get them in now.
No, I think this is it.
Yeah, exactly.
We will not be reading hashtag Would That Be next week. This is something we've done before, but like, it's pretty clear that like if you're a listener of the podcast and you want to be involved, you're a part of the Facebook group or the Discord, which is now all moved to the Facebook group. I'd like one channel of communication. If you want to ask questions on the podcast, just become a patron of $1 or more. You can ask questions every week, and they'll be added to the show. So, because of that, hashtag What They Would has really ended its life cycle. But with that being said, we didn't do transitions this week because of the first hashtag Would That Be Good. Michael, if we tweet it, you'll read it. Why don't you go ahead and read this one?
All right. So this is Spencer tweeting a conversation he's having with Adrian, where Adrian says, "I have a friend in Salt Lake trying to sell some cards. Any shops close to there would be good places to sell to." And Spencer just says, "Really? I know you're forgetting." Adrian says, "Oasis in Salt Lake?" That's basically the gist of it. It was just one of those moments where you're like, man,
I responded, but
maybe
you know
this
who,
sponsorship is more of a one-way street than I had known.
you know who doesn't forget though is our sponsor at Oasis Games. You can check them out at mtgoasis.com. They will give you a kickback on your sells and your buys and your whatevers. Check them out. They're the best. And yeah, I definitely.
Yeah, it's Oasis Games in Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
We're gonna start.
mtgoasis.com or oasisgameslc.com. Fun fact.
All right, and then the other tweet
Stands
is
for Salt Lake City.
yeah. That is a fun fact.
I don't know that we have the same definition of fun here, man.
Well, my standards are low. Scotty is the only other Would That Be Good this week, and he tweets, "Thinking of doing a power rankings for the people I know and tagging them in it. Hashtag Would That Be Good. Hashtag This is going to start some drama." I would recommend doing that.
Can I power rank people?
Oh,
I
he's
know?
ranking the people. I understand.
Yeah,
I was like, what does he mean? I don't understand.
yeah. Don't
I get it now.
power rank your friends. That's
Hold on.
gonna-
I'll power
that's
rank
gonna
my.
only lead to hurt feelings.
Time out. Can I take Maxwell, OB, and Debonair out of this and then power rank my friends?
You can do anything you want.
You can.
So
You
those.
might hang up though, so you know.
So my dog, my wife, and my son are not included in this. And it goes number 1, Quentin. Number 2, probably right now, Manny. Number 3, Matt. Number 4, it's just literally my co-host. This doesn't seem fair at all.
Yeah, I mean, if I slip to like number 11, I'll just leave the call.
No, it's literally. No, it's literally like Quentin, Manny, Matt, Casey, Michael. That's it. That's like my whole top 5. You can actually put those in whatever order you want. I don't care.
Spencer's getting scared. I'm going to click leave. I get it. No, power. I think power ranking your friends and tagging them in it is not a good idea. I would not do.
Yeah.
But The question is, would that be good? And I would say it won't be good, but it might be entertaining.
Right, yeah.
You might learn some fun facts, like that your friends aren't your friends anymore.
You know what you can tweet, though, is hashtag would that be bad, because you never know when we'll read that again. Hashtag would that be good.
It was depressing last time.
Yeah. Just bad things. But that is the end of hashtag would that be good. If you want to be a part of the conversation in the future, join the Patreon, ask Patreon questions. We're happy to answer them. Thank you, everybody, for listening this week. This is like the longest podcast in history. But I learned a lot about myself. I hope that you guys did too.
And hopefully listeners did through osmosis.
Yeah, I think that if nothing else, the listeners can take away how much you can gain from self-evaluation and perhaps getting a group of friends together to evaluate each other.
Well,
Yeah, Matt did our whole podcast in one sentence. That was such a good summary.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you all.
Magic, 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 magic.